Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel, and we've looked at many wondrous structures across the land and the realm, to include the state capital of Utah and the state capital of Pennsylvania. All these structures and the ground that we're flying over right now have tremendous architectural capacity and wondrous geometric precision. And yet in today's exploration, we're going to be focused on looking exactly at the structures that remain, the hard evidence of Tartaria that remains to this day, that you can go visit anywhere in the land.
Are you just a dream, Merlin? A dream to some, a nightmare to others!
We begin by looking at the National Palace in Barcelona, Spain, built 1926 to 1929. Yes, another one of these wondrous structures that was built for an international exposition, because what else would it be? And they managed to churn this one out in 3 short years in Spain in the 1920s, a very impressive accomplishment. When we look closer at the dome and the supporting towers, though, we see the very intricate detail, and this is certainly not a temporary structure, as it is still standing and you can still go visit it to this day. So, in those aspects, it seems to be very different, or an aberration from what we typically come across with these structures built for expositions, or exhibitions, or whatever we want to call them. The great World's Fairs, though, always seem to have a particular aesthetic, and you can see it in this image with the way that they're lighting behind the building. There's awfully something interesting about this image, although I'm not going to jump to any speculation about it, it's just intriguing. Looking at a more contemporary image, we can see that the building still retains its exhibition status, and no doubt it appears as though that's the way it's still used. You can see the details in the construction, and for some reason I'm reminded of the Union Station in Kansas City, and the way that building is now currently used as an exhibition hall, especially for the championship showcase of the Kansas City Chiefs. Looking on the interior, though, we can see that there are aspects of construction that indicate that this is permanent. Look at how well constructed this dome is with all the columns, and then the effort put in the artwork. And recall that this was all completed in 3 years for this international exposition. You know, it never ceases to amaze me how whenever we have an exposition we can pull off anything in a very short amount of time. Now, yes, it was the 1920s. Technology had come a long way from the 1800s, or so we're told. Even these columns we're looking at right now, they try to tell us that these are not actually full alleged columns, but these are merely visual columns, and that they're simply facades. Well, they're holding up quite well if that's the case. Yet on the interior, we see much more ornate and well-decorated columns, as though more effort were put in on the interior of the building. And oftentimes I question why it is that we tend to gloss over the interior of the building, whether it's the mainstream or some of us, when we get into the joy of looking at the exterior of all these great structures, we tend to overlook what's on the inside. Of course, on the outside of this particular structure, no attention to detail has been spared, as we can see the ornate, what will be told are carvings or formations. How exactly was this done in the 1920s? And certainly there must be somebody out there amongst the viewers who has a grandparent that was somehow involved in the construction of this, and by all means I invite you to comment. Let me know what the second or third hand account that you have from your grandparent who participated in the construction of this. And I am not being sarcastic, I would really like to hear this account, because this is quite a stunning piece of architecture, and we are lucky that we still have it, because most of these structures from World's Fairs, exhibitions, we're always told are temporary. Does this really look like this was ever meant to be a temporary structure? No, certainly not. And even more impressive that they could produce this in 3 years in Spain in the 1920s. And remember that the 1920s was that time frame between World War I and World War II, and it occurred right before the Great Depression, which afflicted the entire land. Some very intriguing artwork on the inside of this palace, and it is certainly well worth the title of palace. For whatever reason, I'm also reminded of the way that it compares with all the great state capitals that we've looked at across the United States. And yet this is in Spain, and this is something that they managed to produce in the 1920s. The interior is no less astounding, where you can see some of the arches and the columns and what we looked at with the decoration. And it also has a very impressive organ. Why exactly does it have an organ? Well, you know how I like to focus on what exactly the real explanation is behind the organs, and maybe they just wanted some interior music, or it was perhaps just a final touch. But when you look in closer at the detail on the interior, you can see that there was clearly a lot of effort put into constructing this incredible palace. It's been modernized today, of course, and we can see the touches of modernity that came about with what will be told is urban renewal. but you can still see the original construction that endures to this day. So perhaps that's the heartening story with this particular palace in Barcelona, is that it retains a lot of its natural charm. And I would certainly like to go examine this in person. And if you are in Spain, I certainly encourage you to see the structure in person, because there are a lot of unique intricacies in it that defy the simple explanation that this was truly completed in 3 years. I mean, maybe it was, but if we really were able to do something like this in 3 years, we've lost a lot of capability, haven't we? Spain is such an interesting place with many examples of varied architecture, and we can see many examples of the old world that still survive to this day in many of its great cities. However, there are also other signs that they have embraced the concept of urban renewal. Well, I guess everyone has the choice to do so. Let's move on and look at the Palace of Mafra, moving over to Portugal right next to Spain. And this was built 1717 to 1755, and I put the question mark behind it because we're going back in time, and yet for whatever reason it seems like we have even greater capability. Well, of course, they didn't bang this out in 3 years. It took well over 30, and so that will be the explanation for how they were able to do it. We're informed that King John V of Portugal, in a bout of piety, decided to build this wonderful palace, convent, basilica. We basically give it every title that we can. And looking at it, you can see why. It really is everything. It feels like it's one of the great capitals that we'd see in the United States. It feels like it's one of the great palaces in Europe. And then why not throw a convent in it as well? Because you need to have all these explanations for all these functions to actually have a legitimate background for this building. Otherwise, people might be asking questions that they shouldn't. And oddly enough, we see a combination of so many different architectural styles with this particular palace. And we have the 2 tall towers. We also have a very ornate dome with the portal windows, wondrous cupolas, and fine detail. But we have to look a little bit closer to really appreciate the intellectual and geometric genius that clearly went into the construction of this particular palace. Because when you look at it from the ground up, you can see the way that all the lines seem to intersect and run together. This is a fine precision example of wondrous construction that was done in the 1700s. Now, of course, the explanation for anything in Europe is that they have a longer history, and so they just simply managed to build wondrous palaces like this in the great cathedrals there over time. We even go so far as to say that we had a lot of examples of this great architecture that were actually transported to the United States, such as in Hearst Castle, and that's how we explain the wondrous structures in the United States that manage to match the wondrous structures in Europe, even though they have hundreds or thousands of years more of history in Europe, at least from the current civilization that exists there. Looking closer, though, you can see that this is another one of these structures that has different appearances depending on the light. And it really comes out when looking at the pediment and the columns and then these particular towers. And looking at these towers, I am reminded quite a bit of Hearst Castle. And yet this is a palace that far exceeds it, especially in size. Looking at some of the interior, what we'll be told are cloisters, or whatever you want to call them, with the many arches and the balcony. And then you can also see how the wall and the coloring on the construction material seems to alter a little bit. There's also one of those great rotunda turrets or towers there to the left. And I think that's what gives this structure so many unique appearances. We have some older imagery of it, indicating that it's always been there, but this is still a palace that you can go visit in Portugal today. And you certainly won't be disappointed, because just appreciating its aesthetic beauty and the geometric precision behind it, something that we just don't see for whatever reason with our modern steel and glass constructions. But once again, appreciating the very foundation and the roads that run around this wondrous palace are quite amazing. Again, recalling that this is the early 1700s when they started construction on this, and they didn't finish it until the mid-1700s or so, we're told. How exactly did they pull off all the detailing on these towers? And then, of course, you can see the front entryway with the raised stairs. Once again, this seems to give impressions of an almost science fiction appearance behind this palace, and I'm almost surprised that this palace hasn't appeared in any of the more prominent science fiction movies. I mean, just think, George Lucas could have used this palace as a practical example for the palace on Naboo, right? Okay, no more references to the prequels. But looking at it from every angle and every perspective, you can see that it's an impressive structure, whether you're looking at it from a great distance or up close and personal. And I think that's something that really gives us an indication that we're looking at an old world structure, because you can always see its beauty. It stands out on the landscape no matter how far away from it you are. Yet when you get closer and you look at the precision layout of many of the stones or bricks or whatever the exact composition, the material they used for constructing it, you get the impression of something that is far more advanced. I mean, are we to really just accept that they had armies of people? And yes, of course we are, because this was the king who ordered this in Portugal, and every effort of the nation went to constructing this impressive palace. The interior with the library, and yes, they have quite a fine library in this particular palace, is no less impressive. And you can see with some of the rotundas, the arches, and the domes that they just throw out everywhere on the interior. And of course, they're all well decorated, and we see many of the examples of impressive architecture that aren't even emulated today, let alone constructed on the scale that we're told was achieved back in the 1700s. And indeed, even looking at the ceiling here and seeing some of the wondrous detailings that go in the arches and the indentations and all the effort that they put into this. Now, of course, the explanation will be given is that it took several decades to complete this wondrous edifice. And because it was a project of the king and it was because of a bout of piety, therefore all the effort that was put into it fully justifies it. Of course, there were many other structures that were being constructed simultaneous as to this one. And always when we look at it, yes, you can't have a library unless you have a very well-decorated balcony and many wondrous adornments. Otherwise, how are you actually going to know that it's a library? Indeed, looking at the impressive decorations on this library, it suddenly makes me feel that many of the great Carnegie libraries just aren't cutting the expectation that we have for standards. What exactly is going on here? Look at these wondrous displays with the beautiful figures on every single display, all to decorate a library. Now, of course, the explanation is it's because it's for religious purposes. Well, let's head over to India to look at the Palace of Winds. This was built in 1799. Now, the exact construction history on this particular palace seems to be a little bit less detailed, but yet the construction of this tremendous edifice seems to be far more detailed than we can possibly imagine. Now, we've looked at a few structures in India and Southeast Asia before, and once again we see the same detailings of geometric precision. And in this particular live footage looking at the exterior, we can see that we have a series of domes, and we have many domes that are actually integrated within the wall. Very advanced construction and wondrous capability that's being displayed here. Once again in the 1700s, albeit in the later 1700s, so perhaps they had some great advances in India and they were able to achieve building this palace during that particular time frame. Looking at different perspectives, though, you can see that for whatever reason, there do seem to be similarities in terms of the construction material and how they compare with the previous palaces that we looked at in Spain and Portugal, respectively. You can see that some of the towers in the very center aspect of this particular palace, or you can see that many of the details, though, are very apparent in this particular palace, and we have to wonder and consider what exact construction efforts were required to complete something like this. What were the actual details of planning and construction, and how exactly did they support it logistically? I know we're not supposed to ask questions about logistics, especially when we look at the interior. We see something quite otherworldly when we look at the interior of this Palace of Winds, where we have many different colored windows and different arches, and a series of arches underneath an arch. Wondrous decoration, and again, advanced construction capability that, once again, we do not try to replicate on a large scale to this day. And in fact, the only thing you'll see today is something done on a very small scale. Maybe a single display within a room. Now, perhaps you're thinking, you just need to go out and walk around and look a little bit harder. You need to look at one of those modern skyscrapers, and you'll see something like this. No, that is not the case. Skyscrapers are made out of a completely different material. There is nothing, and there is nowhere, and there is no one who is trying to build a structure like this today. Now, some people say that some of the modern temples or some of the modern churches that are being constructed might compare to this. And maybe so. But it seems to be that the comparison never matches up, especially when you look at it a little bit more closely. You get an idea of quality and endurance in these true bona fide old world structures that defies the imagination. There's also the fact that anything we try to construct to this day does not have this enduring property behind it. But I do have to wonder, what's the real story behind this structure? Is it what we're given, that it was something that was simply built in the late 1700s in India as yet another palace? Or is there a much more intricate story behind it? Is there aspects of its construction that completely exceed anything that we can begin to imagine? Whatever its origin story, it is a wonderful structure that you can still visit and interact with today, and you can prove that it's there physically. There's a lot of footage that shows all the wondrous details, and I would certainly recommend that if you have the means, or if you find yourself in India, or if you are in India, that you visit the structure and appreciate its full beauty. I'm truly impressed by all the domes and all the little towers that we have mixed with the arches. I think that's what gives this structure a very unique appearance. And oftentimes it's the structures that are unique and even stand out from the other wondrous structures. And there's no shortage of incredibly beautiful towers and palaces and other examples in India. And even with that, this structure still manages to stand out, which is one of the reasons why I selected it. Even looking at the many hallways and the alignment of the arches and the fine detail within the palace. And once again, though, there's all these little domes that they managed to construct within it as well. So something that seems extremely advanced and something that, once again, we don't really try to do anywhere at any point in time. And wherever you walk within the structure, you can't help but be overcome by the aesthetic beauty that you see. I'm still amazed at the coloring in a lot of the windows, and I think that's something else that we seem to miss in our contemporary era architecture, is that we don't have the wonderful coloring. We don't have these images that we're looking at right now that really are pleasing and relaxing to the mind. Typically what you'll get are a lot of hard right angles and a lot of shiny reflective glass, especially if you're walking in a modern city. Now, maybe you appreciate that, and if you do, that's completely okay. But I kind of miss the fact that we used to have this in our structures, although when exactly it happened in our chronology is certainly up for debate, because I find it a little difficult to believe that we managed to pull off all these structures within a short amount of time. Although the history of any particular area we supposedly have well documented, and just so long as you don't compare it histories, then you won't have any issue, you won't have any conflicts. Look at the little towers and domes right here next to the more detailed tower off to the right, and compare and contrast what you see. And what's the exact construction material that was used on this? Well, anywhere else across the land we'll be told it's some sort of limestone or sandstone, and we're oftentimes informed what our limitations of concrete are. And elsewhere, this isn't the Palace of Winds, but these are other examples within India of some of the incredible interiors that they have, and I just thought I would showcase them real quick, showing the advanced construction knowledge that they clearly possessed at some point in time. And the coloring behind this is just stupendous. And looking at the interior here, you can see that there are many different examples of not only advanced architecture, but also advanced decoration, because it seems as though this is something else that we don't really want to put the effort into. And of course, we have our usual array of reasons for why we don't put effort into construction architecture to this day. And usually that explanation is, it's just simply not economically viable to build in a manner like this. Indeed. I mean, why build in a beautiful manner of something that's going to endure for hundreds or thousands of years when you can just throw up something that's a lot more temporary, and also something that you can get a lot more contractors and have some wonderful subsidies on. Well, let's move on. And now we go to Illinois to look at the state capitol in Springfield, built 1868 to 1888. And this is one of the great state capitals that we haven't looked at closely on this particular channel yet. Quite an incredible state capitol that they have, and it should be noted that this is the 6th state capitol in Illinois. So much as Chicago has 7 city halls, the state of Illinois has 6 state capitals. Here's the first one that was originally in a small village in the middle of the Mississippi floodplain. Yes, this is where we're told the very first state capital of Illinois was built, and this is what it is, a very modest house that was eventually swallowed by the waters of the great Mississippi. Kaskaskia, if I'm pronouncing that properly. And originally we're told that Kaskaskia was a town of 7,000 people, but the Mississippi flooded, or it changed its course, there's conflicting accounts, and it flooded this entire town, or this little village. There's still a small village with some impressive structures there, and apparently that's where they decided to put the first state capital of Illinois. Very interesting that we have all these accounts of the initial settlement of the area, with both Iowa and Wisconsin having their temporary state capital in Burlington, yet another town that was on the Mississippi. You would think or expect that we'd have more development on the Mississippi, but then you have situations such as this with the massive flooding, and I suppose that makes sense. What exactly is going on? Is it simple natural flooding with the Mississippi, or is there some other reason behind it? Also keep in mind that we're right next to the New Madrid fault line, so perhaps there's other explanations for what's really going on here. In any event, that was the end of the first capital of Illinois, so they moved it to Vandalia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, where they built another state capital in the 1830s. And of course, this is considered a modest one, and let's remember that not 30 years later, just north of Illinois in Jefferson, Wisconsin, they managed to build a high school that looked like a castle, but this was suitable for their state capital at the time. Ah, yes, Abraham Lincoln, and that's what you'll see whenever you go across Illinois because, well, a lot of people who reside or visit Chicago tend to overlook the fact that there's a state outside of Chicago, and it is dedicated to the land of Lincoln, and that's what you'll see on the license plate. Abraham Lincoln looks a little different, though, doesn't he, without his particular beard. And with this state capital, we can see that they have all the trimmings of the historical aspects dedicated to it, so we know that when we're looking at the state capital, we can appreciate the struggle that the pioneers went when they were colonizing this entire land that was untamed at the time and uncivilized. At least that's what the historical account will tell us. And then here's the fifth state capital once they moved it to Springfield, which is where the sixth and current state capital is. And once again, we can see that they've moved up a little bit more with the classic dome and cupola and some columns around it, and then a little couple pediments on either side of it. And that was the fifth one, and apparently this wasn't good enough either. So then in 1868, they needed to go all out and build a gigantic state capital. Keep in mind that while they were constructing this, 1868 to 1888, they were also building other state capitals, such as the Iowa state capital that we've looked at quite extensively. But let's also recall that they were building numerous courthouses in just about every single county. They were building wondrous churches and cathedrals. Ah, yes, there he is again, Abraham Lincoln in front of the current state capital. He just doesn't look the same without the beard. And let's be honest, it's just like Commander Riker on Star Trek. He had to grow the beard. He was a great person before, but then once he grew the beard, it gave him an exponentially awesome factor that could not be denied. The beard does it all. And indeed, it's kind of strange looking at reliefs or images or pictures or statues of Abraham Lincoln without the beard. I mean, the beard has just come to have been associated with his greatness, much in the same way it's associated with the greatness of Commander Riker. Looking on the interior, though, we see another wondrous palace, and just think about the earlier images that we looked at actual palaces in this exploration and compare and contrast with what we have here with the state capital in Illinois. Indeed, we even have pediments integrated into the walls, we have very well decorated columns, and we have many different types of marble. Looking up at the dome, we have another very well decorated dome. It's just incredible what they could achieve in the United States in the 1860s. And keep in mind that by 1868, they were already building their sixth state capital in Illinois. I got confused with Chicago because they got 7 city halls there. So again, all these wondrous administrative government buildings that they were all building within the period of a century. Of course, they haven't built another one since then because I guess they were finally satisfied with this incredible palace that they managed to pull off in 1868 to 1888. That's it. We don't need to build another one. I mean, you would think with the advances in technology and the increase in logistical capacity in the 1900s, somebody would have wanted to build another state capital, an even nicer one, maybe a gigantic skyscraper in Chicago. I don't actually have the capital of Illinois in Chicago. No, that's crazy talk. It's got to be somewhere close to the Mississippi because that's where it makes sense. Oddly enough, we do see some parallels, though, with the state capital in Iowa, and yet its own distinct, intricate flavor of beauty within the Illinois state capital. And this is definitely on my list for an on-site exploration, but for those of you who have the means, I strongly suggest you visit Springfield in Illinois and take a look at this wondrous state capital, because you can see that it has all the fine detailings that we would expect to find in the great palaces in Europe. Oh, look at that, nice little lamps and light posts on the inside of the structure. And again, a very large, cavernous appearance that we have on the inside. Vast amounts of cubic space, and I'd be willing to bet that much like the Iowa State Capitol, that the climate control within inside this wondrous structure is perfect. In other words, you can go in there during those harsh Midwest winters and feel perfectly comfortable where somehow the temperature is maintained at 70 degrees. I wonder exactly what their heating and cooling system is within this particular state capitol. I'm sure it's very comfortable. Love the chandeliers and the lighting because that's exactly what the wondrous politicians of any state need to do effective legislation. Look at the columns, though, around this particular statue, and then look at the floor as well. And again, you can see that we're not just in any sort of regular government building. This really gives the feel of a palace, and that's the reason why I tend to refer to these classic state capitals that were built in the 1800s to the early 1900s as palaces. Because how exactly do you describe these? This is exactly what they were throwing up in the United States in the late 1800s for government activities. And I know we go over it time and time again, but every time I come across a new one, it's the same series of questions that you have to ask. It's even more egregious in Illinois because of the fact that this is the 6th state capital that they decided to construct. And looking at the exterior, you can see that it has some wondrous decorative detailing on it with pediment and columns, and then, of course, the very tall dome that they have. Now, granted, it doesn't have 5 domes like the Iowa State Capitol, but it does have some subsidiary domes that are around the pediment. So, wondrous construction and a very beautiful palace. And indeed, this makes 4 palaces that we have that are close to each other in a very unique pattern in the Midwest. We have this one in Springfield, Illinois. We have the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin. We have the state capitol in Des Moines, Iowa. And then we have the state capitol in St. Paul, Minnesota. Do yourself a favor and take a look at how they line up on a map. It's very interesting. Other aspects of the interior, though, we can see the same decoration with the chandeliers, and then of course we have to have a very decorated ceiling because that's just what you did. I mean, they had 20 years to build this building, although I guess that's showing how the technology kind of fell off a little bit. They weren't able to do it in 3. Wherever you are, whether you're in Texas and you look at the Texas State Capitol or you just go to your local county courthouse, you will find actual examples of the old world that you can interface with directly. And I strongly recommend it because there's an additional element of realism and understanding of what the old world is when you go and interface with the building. And we're fortunate to have many structures from the old world that are still standing today, such as St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And even though the new contemporary era is sneaking in, we still have these structures that we can appreciate. And of course, I think some of the finest examples that we've seen across the land include going back to St. Petersburg in Russia. So it doesn't really matter where you are, Spain, Portugal, Russia, India, the United States, you can find numerous examples of this impressive old world construction. And you can appreciate it and you can interact with it directly. You don't need to rely on pictures, and you don't need to rely on second and third hand accounts. It's something that you can experience firsthand, and it's something that I strongly recommend, because that's the best way to really understand what we're living in. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but...
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be taking a look at Evidence of Tartaria, photo album from the 1850s. And in this particular photo, you see a couple power generators and what looks to be a submarine. Before I get into the presentation, I just wanted to give a little bit of credit. I have seen this photo in other researchers' videos. I believe it was UAP channel, and I think he had some great commentary on it if I'm remembering correctly. But if I'm not, please correct me in the comments. I've got a theme for this video, and it goes against how I usually conduct these videos when I do these explorations because, well, we know that photos can be altered, they can be changed, they might not necessarily be conveying the entire truth, but we're going to look at them today as though they are, and we're going to examine what they're telling us. And going back to the 5 eras theory, what we're really looking at is right here at 1850. Right now, the evidence that I've looked at, my updated theory, is that the reset occurred in 1850, so the first timeline. Right around 1850, either right before it or right after it, that was where the reset occurred, and we're going to be looking at the time frame of photos of the period right after the reset to see if there's any clues or if there's any evidence of a previous civilization existing. I believe that there are plenty of clues, and I also believe that there's even evidence that there are enclaves or survivors of the previous civilization that were scattered around the land, the world, the realm, whatever we want to call it. And I think there are numerous examples of that. So what does official history tell us this photo is? The Chattermanzil Palace wall in India, which was destroyed by mutineers during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. And of course, we already pointed out the amazing Antiquitech, or power generation, features on the building and even on the ship here. We also see some amazing architecture that looks like it's been through something rough. Of course, we'll be told it's just natural erosion, it's difficult weather. And then, yes, I'm not going to overlook it. What looks to be either a submarine or submersible that's potentially washed up ashore here. And we see a lot of junk that's in this little harbor inlet right here, and it's quite remarkable. But what exactly is this? I mean, you see a couple fins. I mean, could this be a submarine? Well, believe it or not, our mainstream history does tell us that submarines existed during this time. Yes, I was a little shocked, but if anybody was big into watching TNT or Turner Broadcasting in the 90s, you might remember a little TV show called The Hunley. It was a made for TV movie about a Confederate States submarine that conducted the first successful submarine attack in 1864. It even had Donald Sutherland in it. So I was surprised to do a little research and found out that the USS Alligator was actually the US Navy's first submarine, and lo and behold, it was created, at least I didn't say founded, built in 1862. And it was based on a design by a French engineer because, of course, it'd be a French engineer who'd have something this amazing. And apparently, submarines just seem to come up out of the blue, and there were practical examples in the 1860s or even the late 1850s. Now, yes, people will tell me, well, what about the turtle from the Revolutionary War? Yes, it was a one-person submersible, and it seemed to be crank and screw driven. But in any event, we do have the wreckage here on the right. This isn't the Alligator, it's actually the Hunley. They did recover the original Confederate submarine, supposedly. Although, if you look at it, it looks more like a torpedo. So, who knows exactly what was going on or what they're telling us? It's just amazing when you really pull apart the official narrative and we're told that, yes, we had submarines in the 1860s, because why not? And down here in the lower left, you can see the plans from the USS Alligator. So, going back to this, not sure if this was actually a submarine, the remnants of the submarine. What I would suspect is if this was just after the reset and the powers that be were resettling many of the areas, they no doubt found a lot of remaining buildings and they found a lot of remaining equipment, whether it was ships or whatever, and of course the technology with it. So, this could have been designs that they found, remaining ships or submersibles all over the place that were not destroyed in the reset, whatever it truly involved. And they were able to either extrapolate designs or get working designs going again. Not sure, but it definitely seems to lead to that indication. Let's move on. A group of Gurkha soldiers with their British officer during the Indian Mutiny or Great Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. Now look how well they're equipped and dressed, and you really have to wonder what's really going on here. Is this a legitimate military operation to suppress a rebellion? Or is there something else going on here? If you look in the nature of conflicts, and the real purpose of this video overall is to introduce some other major clues as to how the world responded after the last reset, and what were the methods in which ensuring that the reset stuck and there was no memory of the previous civilization. And I believe there were three approaches. They utilized conflict, and the conflict was masking the destruction of what remained of the enclaves. They used asylums for the people who did not want to assimilate into the new society or the new world. And then they also had indoctrination, which was gradually implemented in education and society and the major institutions. I'm going to do many videos that are going to follow up on those three themes and how they implemented this. But what this picture could be is you could be seeing a picture of the expeditionary force that was sent to destroy one of the enclaves, and then they simply had a different name for it. Oh, they were suppressing the Indian Mutiny or the Great Sepoy Rebellion in 1857. Yes, see, we got a great picture. And yes, I do think there are clues that the U.S. Civil War was the same thing. But there are many conflicts on record that occurred between 1850 and 1870, and in fact, the rest of the 19th century. So all in good time. The inauguration of President James Buchanan at the east front of the United States Capitol building, March 4th, 1857. Well, there's a lot going on in this picture. Oh, I mean, what is this? I can't tell if this is a ladder or what. This is an amazing picture, but yet the quality of it is either eroded or there's something else going on. I don't know. You'd think you'd get a better picture of a presidential inauguration. And for those of us into U.S. history, James Buchanan was the ineffective U.S. president whose poor leadership allowed the United States Civil War to start. At least that's what official history tells us. And of course, you can see on the Capitol building the amazing columns and some remarkable statues. And people just standing on the roof. It's always people standing on the roof. They seem to love to show that in these old photos. I guess getting on the roof was the cool thing to do. Of course, you'd never be allowed to do that today in any major event, but back then apparently it was encouraged. And perhaps what we see here is, people moving or the photo being distorted by that. It does give that inclination that there were limits to the technology at the time. Okay, fine, so be it. And then another one of the U.S. Capitol building dome under construction, looking south from the roof of the Senate wing, showing the first row of columns near completion and the cast iron pillars up, 1857. That's cast iron pillars, and then it looks like we have some columns. Although, once again, this photo just raises more questions than it answers because, of course, you have the classic vanilla sky, and you'll say, well, the quality of the photo degraded and they just didn't have the technology. Okay, fine, I can accept those arguments. And it looks like we just have a group of workers that are just hanging out and posing, as they tend to do. Just so much mystery when you look at a photo like this, and you have to wonder about it and wonder about this previous photo because it gives the idea that there's limitations in the technology, but then you have other things going on. You have other things going on that really make you question the legitimacy of it. And who knows how these photos could have been altered. Is this guy like a phantom or something? What is going on here? Strange. But then you contrast it with this seascape with a ship leaving port in France in 1857. And look at the detail in this photo. You can see the clouds perfectly fine. You can see the lighting. You can even see the detail in the water. And so I only included this photo just to show you the difference in quality in these images. Because look at this. This is terrible quality in the image. Okay, it's degraded. They had poor technology. Fine. Okay, we can believe it that, it's poor technology. We've got disappearing people and strange things going on here. But then you get to this photo and you see that you can see every detail in it. I mean, the only thing that's different than this being a modern photo is you don't have the color in it. But you can still get the sense of color. It's just an amazing contrast looking at those three photos. Ah, the good old Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, what is now Istanbul, Turkey in 1857. They love to say that 536 was the worst year to be alive. And despite it being the worst year to be alive, it did not stop them from building the Hagia Sophia. A lot of interesting things going on in this photo. Of course, you have this washed out roadway here that looks like it was, I'll just go ahead and say it, flooded by mud or something. Because you can see it for yourself, but I'll just point it out because I can't help myself. And then you have what appear to be, it's hard to tell what's going on with some of these buildings. I mean, were these temporary buildings or they just look very rickety? And then behind it, you've got the Hagia Sophia and all its grandeur and glory. Built in 536 and completed on time despite it being the worst year to be alive in human history. And there are plenty of videos that'll tell you why that was the worst year to be alive. Yes, indeed. Oh, don't worry about the bubonic plague. That was apparently an easy time. And let's not talk about 2020. Anyways, moving on. San Francisco and the harbor from Stockton Street, containing the portions between Washington and Sacramento Streets, 1856. Its 1847 population was said to be 459. And you want to know something? I think this could be accurate, and let me explain why. So we're told that San Francisco was a small settlement. The official account says that in 1847, despite it being a great natural port, and we know how natural ports can just suddenly build and expand and grow very quickly, and it makes sense because they have access to the sea. Fine, so be it. But they tell us that the population was 459 and it was small because of the difficult terrain around San Francisco. And if you've been to San Francisco, yes, you have a lot of hills around there and so forth. Yet I can believe that they're being honest about this if we consider the fact that all these buildings were there, because I find it hard to believe that they established all these amazing buildings. And if you look at these, you'll see these aren't just wooden buildings. You've got some larger buildings, and I think we see some pillars here and maybe even a dome back there. It's hard to tell, but just amazingly built out. And this is only 9 years after the population was 459. And of course, we know the big event was the gold rush in 1849. Okay, well, the problem with the gold rush is how in the heck did all these people get across the United States? Did they cross the continental United States without the Transcontinental Railroad? When they had Native Americans that were righteously angry at them for invading their land, if we go off the historical account, so they certainly wouldn't be keen to let them pass. Okay, so then they got on a sailing ship, which is what this picture is supposed to tell us, and you can find other pictures from earlier time frames like 1859. Well, how did all these ships get there? They would have had to go around the Cape Horn, South America. And the waters around Cape Horn aren't exactly easy. It's very treacherous. But okay, sure, we'll believe it. And all these people showed up. Well, going back to why I think the population was 459, I believe that may have been the population of the survivors that stayed in San Francisco prior to the reset and tried to survive it. I think they may have been very accurate when they said it's 459. It's a very exact number, too. And you'll see that in a lot of accounts with many cities. And you have to wonder if when the city started off with those original population numbers, like this for San Francisco is just utterly bizarre. This is a great natural port if this was in existence, and it should have been because this was originally a settlement, Spanish settlement, and that culture. And if you watch the Zorro movies, you get an idea of that. How could this have been so small for such a long time? Just an amazing photograph, and I think it tells more of a story. But those are just my theories. I could be completely wrong, and the mainstream account could be correct, or there could be something else going on with our realities that we're not sure of. But that's how I'm calling it right now, and that's the theory that I'm proposing. And Battery Street in San Francisco, California, 1856. So again, only 9 short years later. By the way, you can find more dramatic photos from 1851 where they just threw the city up in just a few short years. I guess all these people who were coming here, all these 49ers, were amazing engineers and builders. And I know it's been covered in many other channels, but just look at this. So here you can get the idea of brick buildings. Very clearly a brick building. Nice little dome or tower adornment. I mean, why not put the decoration? You can accomplish anything in 9 short years. And well, here it is, an actual dome. More pillars and columns and, because they just brought everything with them. It was really just easy. And San Francisco is always a remarkable city. Just look at the detail right here. Everywhere you look, you see it. Yes, I think it tells a very different story than what the picture depicts. And now we'll look at some individuals too. Samuel Morse, the American artist and inventor, standing in a studio with an automatic telegraph receiver, which would record incoming Morse code messages onto paper circa 1857. Yes. Samuel Morse. Interesting character. Looks very regal and looks very, very well dressed. I don't know. Looks like he's ready for the blizzard to come in. I sure hope they didn't take that photo somewhere down south in the summer, but maybe there were some different climate situations going on in Georgia and South Carolina. That's where he posed for this picture because that's the reason why the land was so arid there. Those droughts that could randomly occur. I never witnessed one when I lived there for about 10 years, but that's okay. It's possible I could miss things. I mean, strange weather anomalies going on right now if you're in the United States, especially if you're in the Midwest. So anyway, just to give you an idea of how someone could look and who knows what's really going on here. I always found the telegraph very interesting because we try to say it's how news was spread across the United States. For example, the John Brown raid into Harper's Ferry, the official account tells us that everybody in the United States was waiting with bated breath to find out what happened. And I remember asking, well, wait a minute, how could they possibly know? They didn't have radio back then even. Oh, they had the telegraph. Oh, so everybody went to the post office as they depicted in Little House on the Prairie, and then they waited for the person operating the telegraph to read the messages, and they did this every day? Okay, sure, if you say so. Queen Victoria's visit to the Manchester Exhibition of Art Treasures of the United Kingdom, June 1857. I'm not sure which one's Queen Victoria. Maybe right here. Perhaps one of my viewers in the United Kingdom can correct me on this, but I really included the photo because it's pretty amazing. It gives you another example of being able to photograph a large number of people, despite having limited photographic technology at the time. Yeah, we get a little bit of the phantom effect here, and fine, yes, there's explanations for that, but it's remarkable to me how it just seems to apply in some cases and it doesn't apply in other cases. And the answer will be, well, some photographers had better cameras and took more time and longer exposures. Yes, I'm aware of the technical explanations. But when you go through the different photos, you have to wonder what kind of story is being told, and it's always interesting to consider. Peter Force, American editor, publisher, and historian, served as the 12th mayor of Washington, D.C. from 1836 to 1840, circa 1857. Okay, look, I don't know the guy. Quite a name he's got. I mean, with a name like that, you can get yourself elected mayor anywhere, apparently. Peter Force. I don't know, he kind of gives the impression of somebody who's a thug in some way, or somebody who knows what's going on. And I mean, look at that expression right there. Hmm. You get some interesting expressions too when you look at these older photos. I mean, they certainly didn't smile back then, but yeah, this guy has a borderline leer almost on his face, as though he's plotting something, or he knows something. Or maybe he knows nothing and he's just some older gentleman they decided to take a picture of. I don't know. I never really heard him much in historical context prior to seeing this picture and just thought I'd include it. Cloud study over Paris, circa 1850s. Just we'll get a couple pictures of Paris. Paris is very clearly a beautiful city, and of course, everyone talks about the romantic connections to Paris, and yes, I understand that. Of course, there was an earlier video featured on this channel where we talked about the catacombs of Paris and a very different presentation of what could be going on there. But I included this one because you get some great buildings, and also it does capture the clouds pretty well. Although oftentimes we see the clouds completely washed out. And yes, there's technical explanations for why that happens as well. But here's a photo that shows you can see the clouds and even some decent sunlight. Paris looking back toward from across the Seine, circa 1857. Again, just look at the amazing build out of Paris at that time. I mean, it almost gives you the inclination that this is the modern city of Paris. I mean, look at the road here. What's exactly going on here? It's like they needed to wash it off like it was covered with dirt. And maybe it was because of all the wagons that were going on it. But just remarkable detail that you see in some of the structures and the traffic on the river. And look at these bridges. They built them during the Middle Ages. Probably built them during the bubonic plague. They would say that because you can build the Hagia Sophia during the worst year in history, and it doesn't stop it. So why would it stop people in France from building amazing bridges when half of the population was dying of the bubonic plague? Right? Well, look at this. You got like this little fairy tale tower back here, in addition to the amazing cathedral and the other tall towers. And just look at the detail of all these buildings. I wonder what this photo would look like if we actually had one in color. And that's something else you have to be careful because, we'll have our good friends artificial intelligence colorizing these photos, but we know that's not what they really looked like. So there might be an entirely different picture to see behind it. Morlaix, I think I'm saying that correct. And looks like we got a group of ladies walking about doing their business. And, again, it looks like the area has just been subjected to some sort of force, and it's hard to say what because again I see this nature of the arid land, and of course people might counter that, well, that's just how it looked, it was dirty, it's a port, it's by some water. Okay, fine, so be it. But you've got some amazing buildings with some detail that you always see hidden all over the place, and it's Europe, they probably built it during the 14th or 15th century, or during the Renaissance. They could do all kinds of amazing things during the Renaissance, so we're told. Nice little tower back here. And clearly, I don't know what this is, but you see some bricks around with it. Looks like some sort of, I don't know, circular trash depository. I doubt that's what it is, but maybe it's an area to moor ships. Maybe you got one down here. Hard to tell. Ah, yes, the Viaduct de Morlaix. This was built in 1861 to 1863. And look at this. Just an incredible structure that they run trains over. And of course, you get another example of great buildings in this little area, but just a remarkable engineering achievement. And I wonder how that's done. So 1861 to 1863. Hey, at least they say it took them 2 years to build it, and they didn't just throw it up in a month or so. I'm surprised they didn't say that. Well, you can still see it today, apparently. And it looks like it's holding up pretty well. I mean, people can still walk on it, and trains can still run on it. I mean, look at the arches and all the blocks that went into it. 1861 to 1863. Make of that what you will. They could do amazing things in France. Not only did they record amazing buildings, but they could build them too. Got to give them credit. Yes, the Dome of the Rock, a little photo of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem's interesting because when you look at it, you do get some inclinations of perhaps the timeline making a little bit more sense, or at least some of the buildings being a little older. Of course, if you've been in that environment and you understand that just going a couple months can take an extreme wear and tear on buildings over there, just with all the fine dust and particles that constantly flow around. But very beautiful, very amazing detail, a lot of arches right here. And nice little tower here. And of course, many other researchers have covered this amazing structure and the remarkable architectural achievements in it. And there's beauty that seems to have persisted in Jerusalem for years. It's perhaps a place where we could really believe the narrative because it does look like it, to be objective. Now let's go back to the United States. Quincy Public Market in downtown Boston, 1857. Oh, yes. And here's where we see our amazing large columns that come up a lot in United States architecture. And here we have this nice dome. I don't know, this almost looks like one of the amazing buildings that was featured in one of the many so called World's Fairs. Anyways, it's just remarkable to see this kind of achievement. And then even down here on the road, you get the idea, or the parking area. Is this dirt? Is this brick? Not really sure. It almost looks like it could be brick here, but I don't know. I'm not there. Got a horse here pulling a cart, but we're supposed to believe that horses and carts and human labor erected this beauty and did it back before 1857, because obviously it was built before the photo was taken, or at least we'd like to think. Got a nice building back here too. And looks like you've got one of those old style roofs on this building. Boston's got an interesting story to it. And oh yes, by the way, Boston was the victim of another one of those unbelievable magical fires of the 19th century. Boston in a busy Boston harbor looking north from the State House dome in 1858. And when you look closely in this photo, you can get the details in some of the buildings. I mean, look at this. Really? This kind of reminds me of the interior of the Iowa State Capitol, where they have these amazing adornments over every single door. It's quite remarkable. But when you look carefully, you see the little dome rotundas, you see amazing architecture all over the place. And we can try to buy it with Boston. The city's been around. It was featured prominently during the American Revolution in the previous century. Okay, fine. But even so, it's still the same limitations. Horses, carts, human labor. No heavy machinery, rudimentary cranes, which we saw in the earlier photo. And it's just so much detail that's established in a very large city. It's impressive, however it came to be. Parker House Hotel, possibly in the late 1850s, and you see the same thing. And you'll see this in small towns around the United States and all over the world. But I mean, look at the roof on this and the detail on the top of it. And right down here in the entryway. Amazing. Just remarkable. And what are these? Are these gas lamps, or are these powered through some other means? And then you've got some more lamps right here. What exactly is going on? Of course, they'll tell us, well, somebody went around and they climbed in and they lit them every night. Okay, fine. But just a very beautiful photo. Great Eastern, while under construction at London's Millwall Ironworks on the River Thames, November 18, 1857. The size of this thing. It's like they built the Titanic long before the Titanic. What are these people doing right here? And it looks like you got a couple supervisors here with their top hats on. People were all about wearing their top hats back then. But it kind of looks like they're just standing around. It almost looks like this was something that one of the, we'll just call it recovery crews that was going around, because you got the gentlemen with the top hats on, and there's always questions to be asked when they appear. They found this amazing ship. They didn't say they constructed it. It'd be funny if they said they founded it. You don't see that with large ships. We had to construct it. Same thing with submarines. I mean, just look at this. I mean, this axis here looks like this is something that they may have built. It was something that we believe that they could do. But just remarkable. And if you look at the Great Eastern, it was a gigantic ship that didn't really make a lot of sense for building it. And apparently they had a lot of challenge with even getting it into the water. So I'd include that one. Back to the sign in Paris. And here you see more examples of the amazing bridges, some of the remarkable buildings, all the arches, and then the roof work and the detail. And of course, we'll go back to that story that, well, Paris has been around for a very long time. We'll even say hundreds or over 1,000 years. But still, it's just remarkable what you see. And I'm not even covering, the human activity or lack of human activity in some of these photos. I mean, it looks like there could be a couple people on this bridge and some people over here. Not sure. But it's still amazing to consider. An abbot accompanies students visiting the Roman Forum in Rome, Italy, circa 1857. This guy's an abbot. It looks like he's wearing one of those special hats, and just found a kid roaming around the area and said, hey, you're coming with me. I'm going to take a look at this. Look at the forum here. And Here's what's amazing. So we're supposed to believe that this is the ruins of the Forum and that it just stayed here and hung out here for over 1,000 years and nobody messed with it. Look at that right there. Hexagonal walkway, it looks like. Not sure. But all these societies came and went, all these governments came and went, and during the hardest times of human existence, to include 536, the worst year to be alive, according to many sources, and nobody touched any of this, nobody took this. I mean, they tell us that they took the stones from the pyramids in Giza, and of course, you might remember this particular building. It was featured in one of my earlier videos as it bears a striking resemblance to the dome on the Iowa Capitol, even though the Iowa Capitol was built hundreds of years later. And we won't talk about Trajan's Column, we've already been there. Interesting photo. A cathedral in Baltimore, Maryland, 1856. Yes, look at these. This is definitely something we associate with the United States, with this kind of architecture. And look at this walk that this gentleman is standing on. Just incredible. Nice curb there, too. That almost looks like something out of modern times. And of course, we have another one of these incredible lights that's just sitting there, and one back there, too. Amazing buildings. And, it looks like Baltimore, for whatever reason, at least this section of it, was spared a lot of the ravages that came with whatever the last reset was. We even have some trees that look like they're doing well. Another amazing tower. Look at the brick here. I mean, this almost looks like modern brickwork right here. And this stonework. Of course, they tell us it's modern, but we know that the older buildings do have what appear to be better brickwork. But here's a first-hand example of it from 1856. Unless you want to believe that this photo was altered in some way, and I'm certainly open to that discussion. And they all could be altered in some way. So that's why it's interesting to explore them and why I say they provide clues. Construction workers build a new jail in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1857. Well, I think they're being honest right there because, the United States, land of the free, is, well, let's just say the prison industry is quite a large industry, and we have quite a large percentage of the population incarcerated in the United States, land of the free. But, okay, so this is St. Paul before the United States Civil War, and even before the Dakota War, which was a Native American uprising that occurred in Minnesota during the Civil War. So we're to believe that Minnesota sent a great majority of its population to fight in the Civil War, but then it also had to contend with a Native American uprising. Interesting story. But you've got some of these buildings, and I mean, here we are in Minnesota, built out buildings in St. Paul, and there's some very severe weather there. I don't know if this is a church or an administrative building or what. Looks like it could be either or, but you also get the impression that there are people that are settling in the area too. So, I mean, there are some clues that the narrative could be on point here, and yet there are things that contradict it. Interesting photograph, and you can spend a lot of time looking at photographs just from the settling of Minnesota in that time frame. So we're going to be revisiting this period right after the reset in the 19th century, in the 1850s, and the decades that follow, looking at conflicts, asylums, and indoctrination. But I saw something that I wanted to share with you, so I've included a bonus on this video, the Golden Bridge in Vietnam. Now, I had never heard of this before. I was never aware of this. I did extensive historical studies in Vietnam in my previous career because of the U.S. conflict in Vietnam and also just the ongoing nature of conflict in Vietnam. In 4 decades, Vietnam defeated Japan, it defeated France, it defeated the United States, and it ended it by defeating China. That's what mainstream history tells us. So when I found out about this, and I just happened to see this in random 4K imagery that I typically have playing when I'm assembling the videos, I noticed this image and it just stuck with me. The Golden Bridge in Vietnam, in Da Nang apparently. But just look at this. These amazing stone hands. I'm not exactly sure what they're made of. I haven't been there. And the image just stuck with me, just this amazing vista. I'd never seen anything like this, and I was certainly not aware of it. And I wanted to look into it, and I wanted to share it with you because it's remarkable. And I didn't know the story behind it. And certainly for any viewers who've been to Vietnam, or if I have any viewers from Vietnam, I would certainly love to hear more about the story of the construction of this incredible site. I mean, when I see the detail in these hands, I'm sort of reminded of the detail that you see in Mount Rushmore in the United States and South Dakota. I mean, it's incredible. And I mean, look at this close up. Look how large this is. And yet the detail in it. I mean, they built this, okay. Who and how? I would like to find out. It's just remarkable and it's gorgeous. It's two hands and an amazing view where they established a structure. And here's another angle of it. And I mean, I don't know. I don't know how they built it. I don't know how they did this. It's incredible, though, and need to look into it. I want to see what the story behind this is. And again, I'm inviting viewers if they know of this construction. And I've already done the initial look for construction photos and haven't found anything. That doesn't mean that they're not out there and just didn't find them on initial search. So if anybody has construction photos of this amazing structure, I would love to see them. So please let me know. Oh, apparently there's also a castle structure. It looks like a castle in the same vicinity. So I think we're going to have to take a look at this on the big map before we pop out and look at the story behind it. See what the mainstream has to tell us about the Golden Bridge. The Golden Bridge is a 150-meter long, 490-foot pedestrian bridge near Da Nang, Vietnam. It is designed to connect the cable car station with the gardens, avoiding a steep incline. Sensible enough. And to provide a scenic overlook and tourist attraction. Well, even more sensible if you go off the concept of tourism. The bridge loops nearly back around to itself and has two giant hands constructed of fiberglass and wire mesh designed to appear like stone hands that support the structure. So they're saying it right here. They're giant hands constructed of fiberglass and wire mesh designed to appear like stone hands that support the structure. Okay. The client for the project was the Sun Group. The bridge was designed by TA Landscape Architecture under Ho Chi Minh City University of Architecture based in Ho Chi Minh City. All right, the bridge opened in 2018. Construction began in July 2017 and was completed in April 2018. It's not quite a year. Very intriguing. So they're saying that those hands are made of fiberglass and wire mesh. I really wonder. I mean, is there anybody out there that was involved with this construction who saw this, who has actually been there and can verify? I'm just asking a question. I mean, this could be all it is. It could just be fiberglass and wire mesh, and a very challenging environment that exists in Vietnam. And, it's pretty. Not sure. Let's see what else. What do Reuters have to say about it? Da Nang, Vietnam. In the mountains of central Vietnam, a colossal pair of hands lifts a golden thread of walkway high above the cliff tops as if the mountain itself has sprouted limbs. Funny they say that. I feel like I'm walking on clouds. It's so unique. It does look unique. It's attracted scores of tourists since it opened in June. I could see why. The pedestrian walkway, designed by TA Landscape Architecture, okay, so it does verify the account, sits at over 1,000 meters, 3,280 feet above sea level, and extends over the treetops. The bridge was designed to evoke the image of a giant hands of gods, interesting, pulling a strip of gold out of the land. Creates a walkway in the sky. But it is the Golden Bridge and its supports, two huge stone-colored human hands styled in such a way that it looks as if the jungle is struggling to reclaim them, which have garnered the most attention from visitors. The two smooth giant hands look real. Yes, they certainly do. It makes me feel like humans can do anything with fiberglass and wire mesh in Vietnam. Okay. All right. Well, let's just conclude this by taking a look at exactly where this is. So, we're in Vietnam. Near Da Nang, it would appear. Oh, look at this terrain that this is on. Nice big giant hill. Well, nothing suspicious about that, right? Of course it'd be on a nice big giant hill. And it looks like there's the walkway. And there are the hands. See if we can get on the ground. Or utilizing the man, as John likes to say. Oh, yeah. Fiberglass and mesh. What do you think? I don't know. I mean, it's possible, but they're very extraordinary. What else is on this hill since we're here? Oh, look at that. A couple of castles. Lunar Castle and Ravenstone Castle. We have any access near there? No, of course we don't. Very beautiful. It definitely makes you wonder. Well, I think I'll leave it there. But if anybody was involved in that construction, or anybody has construction photos or knows a little bit more about this interesting story, feel free to share it. That's what exploration is all about. And it could well be this is just a simple contemporary human story, and we just are looking to validate it. There's nothing wrong with asking questions like that. As I always say, ask questions, search yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and thank you for joining me for our exploration today into the ancient enemy. In our explorations, we've come across the question of what happened to the civilizations that preceded ours, and that includes the mainstream. The mainstream indicates that civilizations that preceded ours fell. But who is the ancient enemy? Is it something that's external, or is it something internal? Is the ancient enemy something that's deep within our hearts and our souls? Or is it an external threat? An existential threat that constantly reappears every so often? Let's find out. We go back to the five eras theory, and we know that in the previous eras, each of the civilizations in our five eras theory ended for a variety of reasons. We state that this is a major or a hard reset. A hard reset because something changed that caused the civilization to fall. Oftentimes we point to the presence of an ancient enemy. But what is the ancient enemy truly? Is it something that's external, or is it something that's found within each human being? Or is it something that's both? One of the theories goes is that the previous era, the fourth era or the Tartarian age or civilization that preceded ours, was destroyed by some sort of enemy that appeared. This enemy was initially an external enemy, but then it became an internal enemy. Oftentimes people will tell you simply to follow the money. They just say follow the money, and it will lead you to the root of all the forces that control civilization. And this refers to our current era. Did something happen in the previous era, though? What did the news tell us? News tells us to think what we tell you, we're all in this together, do not question authority, do as you're told and you'll be left alone. And oftentimes we have things such as demons are scary and shapeshifters are very scary. What's the point behind all this? They seem to be intending to generate a lot of fear. And fear is something that is existential, and it's also ideal. In other words, there is a real physical fear that something terrible can happen to you, but at the same time, it's also the idea of fear. The idea of an uncertainty. It's the ideas of uncertainty that oftentimes compel us to action. Remember in the film The Matrix when they talked about the red pill and the blue pill. So what happened to the previous civilization? We believe that an external force appeared and the previous civilization managed to defeat it initially during its height, but then this external force changed its tactics and preyed upon the internal weaknesses that had existed in many of the people of this civilization. Now, what were these internal weaknesses? That's what we're going to be exploring. We know in our own current civilization, we believe that all roads lead to the money and the control of money and the influence of money. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because while you can say that if you follow the money, you'll be able to determine who's really in control, is that really the reality that we face, or is that merely the appearance of the reality that we face? We're told in many nations that our politicians have final control over the money supply. They can increase the debt ceiling, they can borrow more money without any fear of limitations, and their banks or their national power will support them in doing this. And on the surface, this appears to be the truth. But what does this really reflect? Who actually has control? The legislatures, the executives, the judicial branches of these various governments? And of course, we're told that some nations have supposed democracies, others have constitutional republics, others have parliaments, and others operate under dictatorships. But the answer always seems to be the same. Just follow the money is what everyone will tell us. Money will explain to you who's in control and how they have control. However, is the supply of money finite? Or is money even real? I remember what actor Jeremy Irons said in the movie Margin Call, when he stated, "It's just money. It's not even real. Just pictures printed on paper so we don't kill each other for dinner or breakfast." Yet this idea exists for all of us as our primary force of control. We all know that we have to operate within the facet of money in order to achieve our existence. But do we have control over money, or does money really control us? It's always a question that we ask, and people always think that you can follow this rabbit hole down and you'll be able to ascertain exactly who has total influence and control over the money. We know that some people are reliant on their paychecks, and other people can simply type a number in the computer, and they've created $100,000 or 100,000 dinar, or whatever currency you're dealing in. It's a constant contest between understanding what the system truly is and what the system can really be. We're dissuaded from asking these questions. And it goes back to what I showed with the news report. Do as you're told and you'll be left alone. Simply comply. It's always easy to comply. It's always easier to consent. It's the path of least resistance. Work a job. And if you want to affect change, then become a politician. All these roads are open to you, at least in certain nations. However, I want you to consider something else. Levels of awareness of means of control. We're only aware of one level, the level of money, where you have to work a job, you have politicians that supposedly have influence over a system, but those politicians can be bought, and yes, that includes dictators. You believe that banks have control over the money supply, and yet there seem to be other forces that may control the banks that we're not aware of. You can follow this all down to achieve the ultimate theory as to one family or one group of families that may have total control over the world. But is this really the way it is, or is this simply one level? Consider that there may be other levels of control that we can't observe. One of our greatest misconceptions, I believe, is that the forces that operate against us in the world have to disclose these things to us. But where is that written as a hard and fast rule? Why would the ancient enemy ever play by the same rules that we do? Perhaps this is merely a misconception that they wish to cultivate, so that we believe that we can determine who's really in control. But we don't see that there are other levels of control that we're not even aware of. And we're going to explore what those other levels of control can be. Yes, you can follow the money, and yes, you can determine or come up with theories in terms of who's in control, simply by following the money. And it may give you an idea. But consider the fact that that's only one level of control. Go up to the next level. What exactly is this physical control? And then another level beyond that, spiritual control. How does that work and what's that all about? There may be many more levels, even above spiritual control. But those are speculated. We'll just stick with these three levels for right now. Consider the existence of Cthulhu, an ultimate evil, something that was posited by H.P. Lovecraft in his works. And yes, we consider the works of horror fiction and science fiction because those ideas were inspired from somewhere. The interesting thing about Cthulhu is it's an ultimate evil that's able to inflict horror, terror, and destruction on a worldwide scale. It's something that has ultimate control and comes from another realm. The dark ones, the deep ones, the ancient ones. All the different names, and all the greatest fears that human beings have ever had. Not just in this civilization, but all the previous civilizations. And whether you go off the mainstream account or alternate research, there have always been adversaries such as these. Every religion seems to have a devil, and every form seems to have some sort of evil, or an ancient evil. However, when we really examine the nature of evil, how often is it that something is truly evil, or is it simply evil because we're told it is evil? We're always told and compelled and incessantly reinforced that we have immediate threats and that we have to act to immediately alleviate those threats. And you can see this from any perspective, whether you're defending your nation or you're defending your own personal welfare in life. Yet Cthulhu is interesting because Cthulhu supposedly has the ability to influence and affect people on the inside. And what does that really mean? It has the ability to change the way people think and operate and believe. And that's why Cthulhu is considered such a dangerous enemy. An ancient enemy that we like to believe that has all this power. But if such an adversary truly exists, and there was this kind of power, how would we even be capable of questioning it? How could a video like this even be made? How could other videos by other content creators that openly question this be made? And there may be an answer. Maybe that's simply what it wants. Maybe it simply wants us to constantly flop around and come up with different theories and utilize our time. We also consider another Lovecraftian creation, the Mygo, a terrifying creature, perhaps even more terrifying than the very large and godlike Cthulhu. The Mygo were an alien creature, and they specialized in feeding on human beings. Even more terrifying, they specialized in experimenting on human beings. And perhaps this is something that you could see with the physical control element. Imagine if there's some sort of force out there that can't be perceived and has the capability of imposing physical control on human beings. It does so by physical pain. It does so by changing the physical nature of human beings. The terrifying aspect of the Mygo was a body horror element, where they could simply remove people's brains and keep them alive. It seems a little cliche now, but when this was new, back in the 1930s and 1940s, this was a terrifying idea to many people. This was considered the very classic aspects of horror. And a lot of people view and see Lovecraft as the ultimate master of true horror. And for this very reason, that the physical control that can be placed on human beings to where they completely lose their will is something that's beyond our darkest nightmares. And yet at the same time, we're very well aware of it. We're capable of imagining it and considering it. And therefore, as terrifying as the Mygo may be, they probably are not the ultimate form of what we might consider the ancient evil. But they could represent some aspect of it. Now, am I saying that in one of the past civilizations there was some sort of creature like the Mygo that came and infiltrated the society? Well, anything's possible. But I think there's something even more darker and more insidious that could have been much more likely. Because even a creature such as the parasitic Mygo can be seen, and they could be detected, and very likely they could be defended against. However, consider the fact that there might be other forces or other creatures that would not so easily be defended against. It was really more the idea of the Mygo that induced fear within people. And it's oftentimes inducing fear that leads to a lot of control. Because it's simply the fear of what may or may not happen. Or not even the existential fear, but the idea of fear that can be used to achieve control on people. So the Mygo exists as something that is a warning of some sort of external force that could impose physical control over people against their will and force them to do their bidding, while at the same time continuing to inflict eternal torment. And now we go to the origin of all the snake cults, or the natural human fear of snakes, serpents, and reptiles. The natural fear of serpents, a lot of people will tell you, is instinctive. And yet at the same time, famous scientists such as Carl Sagan will tell us that we have a reptilian portion of our brain because of our evolution. Our evolution means that we may have once resembled creatures like this. Now, to be fair, he doesn't show this in his evolution animations. But he does give indications, and he does very clearly state that we have a reptilian side of our brain. In the past, could there have been snakemen creatures like this? Anything's possible. Yet, once again, this is something else that alludes to the idea of an ancient evil. The idea of an evil of serpents that have been with us for all time. We also look at some of the base symbols in religions and in other aspects of society. We'll see that the serpent is very firmly represented. At the same time, you'll even see the serpent in other locations, such as in the medical symbol, interestingly enough. Some people are terrified of serpents and snakes, and other people find them charming and wonderful pets to have. And all you need to do is go down to Florida and go through the Everglades, and you'll find no shortage of Burmese pythons, released as former pets, and now an invasive species in the Everglades. We come back to this idea, though, of why the serpents can induce terror in some people, and why other people venerate them, even worship them, because once again you can find no shortage of some certain religious groups who worship the serpent. It has a dual meaning. It can be seen as a power, which people respect, and it even refers back to the god of Set, which is featured in many different pulp fiction stories. And we also see it reflected in many movies. And even as recently as He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And I'm talking about the second iteration, well actually I believe it'd be the third iteration, that came out in the early 2000s, where they talked about the Snake Men and the fact that Snake Mountain was actually the petrified or frozen god of the snakes. We always see snakes and we wonder if they represent the ancient evil that's always been with us, because of their reference in many different biblical texts and other religions. Yet we also have to consider that there's another perception, that snakes really aren't so evil and they're something to be venerated. So what's the final conclusion with snakes? It seems as though it depends on the society and the people. Some live in great fear of them, some have a natural instinctive fear of them, and others see them as companions. Others see them as an element of power or an element of something that shows wisdom even. What do you think they really represent? Let me know in the comments. It's safe to say that there is a lot of snake symbolism that's been with our culture and our society and very likely with previous civilizations. And we'll be told at the mainstream that the snake was very much venerated by previous civilizations. Why exactly do they do that? Is that from official studies, or is there some other reason for telling us that? You'll see no shortage of imagery that shows what kind of power the serpent could have, and why it was actually venerated as an aspect of life. And yet other civilizations feared the serpent and stated that it had the power to consume all life on the lands and across the world. It's a symbol, it's a demon, and yet to others it's a god. So is this some way to determine what the natural inclination of certain human beings are? Or do people simply have different backgrounds, and do they simply look at serpents differently depending on where they come from and what they're really raised to believe? It's hard to say. I will say that, based on my own background, that serpents are considered evil, threatening creatures. And in the course of my lifetime, I've never been personally afraid of serpents when I've come across them. They're just animals to me, like many other animals, to be respected. And at the same time, they do reference serpents in terms of dragons. And considering this fantasy approach, we oftentimes hear of how dragons are related to great serpents, or giant worms. The words and the terms are used interchangeably. So could this be some sort of memory that's endured with us? We don't know. We move on finally to the Hyperion series. This was a science fiction series written by Dan Simmons that posited a utopian society in the future. And this utopian society was capable of space travel. They had a wonderful set of society with many different cultures that were amalgamated and working together. Yet at the same time, there was a devastating evil on the planet Hyperion. An evil that consisted of a killer angel called the Shrike, and also the terrifying creatures of the Cruciform. And we'll explore the Cruciform. The Cruciform was a creature that would attach itself to the human body and acted as a parasite. And yet over time, the longer one was exposed to a Cruciform, their bodies would begin to denigrate and degenerate and lose their identity, losing their identity as an individual person in every way, shape, and form. The only way a cruciform could be removed from the body was if the Shrike, the angel that existed on the planet Hyperion, would remove it. Now, how exactly does this relate back to our ancient enemy in the old world? Consider the fact that in the story of Hyperion, the cruciform was captured by the society, it was studied, and they managed to scientifically alter it because one of the other side effects of the cruciform was that it would provide eternal life. Now, this is just what the story says. I'm not passing any judgments, but in the far future, the Catholic Church ultimately uses the cruciform and bestows a cruciform on a person in which they're able to remove the effects of taking away the individuality, and the cruciform enables the person to live forever. The only catch is you have to convert to the Catholic Church. And that's one of the main plot elements in the story of Hyperion. Now consider, in the past, if there was such a thing as a cruciform, that utilizing the promise of eternal life was used as a means of encouraging people to conform, to consent to a particular power. Here we see the Shrike engaged in battle and how terrifying it could really be, this killer angel. But ultimately this was not the greatest threat in the story of Hyperion. The cruciform was the greatest threat. An external threat can kill, but an internal threat can control. The cruciform represented both. It was a parasitic creature that attached itself to your body, and once attached, there was no way to remove it. There were a couple ways, but usually they would kill the patient. And the only way it could be removed without killing the patient is with the Shrike, which is the creature depicted here. In the past, something such as the cruciform may have been used to achieve control on people. And people desiring eternal life and desiring a life free of struggle and strife may well have accepted this, all at the cost of forfeiting their individuality. And there's a reason why the cruciform in its presence is considered one of the most terrifying entities. More terrifying than Cthulhu, more terrifying than the Mygo and their external body horror threats. And the reason for that being is we oftentimes see what the true ancient evil is. We start to get an idea of what it's really all about. It's not about all these external threats, all these terrifying monsters and apparitions of snakes and large creatures that can destroy entire lands and entire worlds. It's really about the ability to inflict control on human beings. The ability to use terror and fear to constantly compel people to do that which they may not do without it. And we see this in every approach, and this is something we see throughout our daily lives. And all you have to do is watch the news and you'll be told what you're supposed to be afraid of. You'll be told what you're supposed to think. And you'll be told what it is you're supposed to conform to. Therefore, you can be alleviated of this fear. Yet at the same time, we can also see what this leads to. This leads to a complete forfeiture of individuality. This leads to the desecration and destruction of any of our own dreams or desires. It is not existing in a balance with society, where the society supports the individual and the individual supports the society. This is a society that requires the individual to sacrifice everything to support it. And it achieves this by the promise of eternal life, by the promise of benefits, or now, as it's evolved into, the simple promise that things will not be worse. Things will not be as bad as they were in the past. Because it's never about making things better in the future. It's always about you don't want to descend to how bad things were in the past. How many times are we told that every day? And how many lands are people told that every day? That yes, you may have to sacrifice something, you may have to accept a decrease in the quality of life, but it's still so much better than it was in the distant past. We're never going to descend to how things were hundreds of years ago. Yet at the same time, this is why we have to question what the actual account of the past is. Because the account of the past, whether it's true or not, is used as an element of fear to achieve control. Why do we talk about the cruciform? Because it's an analogy. It's an analogy for how we wish to live an easy life, how we wish to reach our goals, but what are we really willing to sacrifice? And do we ever question that which we're willing to sacrifice in order to achieve our goals? Everybody fears death, whether they know it or not, whether they consciously think on it or not. But because of that powerful impulse and that desire to avoid death. The ultimate irony from the Hyperion story is that the Catholic Church, which promised eternal salvation once you died, ultimately guaranteed eternal salvation by preventing people from dying by attaching this cruciform parasitic entity to their bodies. Did something like this happen in the past? Was this a way in which the previous civilization may have been subverted? It may have been turned against itself? I think there's a lot of inclinations that while this might not have been the exact method, something very similar to this happened. This could well have been the alternate approach that some sort of external force was finally able to use to destroy previous civilizations. And it's safe to say that this ancient enemy could well still be with us to this day. It just operates in a different manner than it did in the past, and yet it still looks to achieve the same ends, the same goals. What it all comes down to is us, every individual. And how is it that we resist something like this? Well, think about what you go through in your daily life. Ultimately, you have to decide what your goals are, and you have to decide what you're willing to make compromises on. Where and what do you grant consent to? Now, it's safe to say there are people out there that want to help you, and there are people out there that don't care to help you, and they wish to hinder you. You have to ask yourself, are people really trying to do either, or are they simply trying to influence you and control you? And if they are, what's the best means to resist that? Because if you have that kind of awareness, it's very easy to resist it. You simply ignore it. You don't have to be rude to people. You don't have to act in a violent manner at all. You simply have to have awareness. Is removing consent that simple? Is resisting the ancient evil that simple? Yes, I think there are a lot of indications that it is, and it could be. Why do you think so much time is spent on getting us to focus on money, on getting us to focus on fears? Fear of being broken, fear of living in a worse state than people did in the past, or fear of what may happen in the future if we don't conform to what we're supposed to conform to. It all comes down to the fact that there are 3 levels of control, and there may be more levels of control. You're able to see level 1, and you can follow it all down to every theory that you have, perhaps even determining there may be existing conspiracies. But what does it really matter if there's another level of control that you can't see? That there are some individuals that are controlled through physical means who don't operate with the limitations of money. And then individuals who are controlled through a spiritual means, who don't operate through either money or physical influences. Consider that. At last, we turn to the example of Spartacus. Spartacus, a movie from 1960 starring Kirk Douglas as the Thracian slave, we're told in the opening narration that Spartacus was sold into slavery by his mother when he was 13. Or actually, I should say he was born into slavery as his mother was a slave, and by the age of 13 he became a slave. But he grew up proud and rebellious. Yet the narration also tells us that he went through his entire young adult life. I believe Kirk Douglas was in his late 30s or 40 when this was filmed. And finally, after accepting slavery for a couple decades, he reaches his breaking point when a friend collapses and he attacks a Roman guard. Now, the movie would have been over if the Roman guard just pulled out his gladius and stabbed him, which we would expect to happen. Yet our official history also tells us that this led to a great slave revolt, which the Romans finally crushed. Now, why do I bring this example up? This example of Spartacus is that he consented to this kind of control for 20 years. We're supposed to believe that he was rebellious and strong-willed, and yet he was willing to be a slave for 20 years and didn't reach his breaking point until after 20 years. Now I know you're just going to tell me it's a film. Of course it is. But consider this. Slavery is evil because people don't have the opportunity to consent. They're forced to do it. And yet in the modern era, you are given consent to anything, and therefore it's not slavery, and therefore it's okay. Consider the example of indentured service. The means that was once used to pay for passage to the New World, or from Europe to North America, or so we're told. And consider that now it's not indentured service, you consider it a loan if you want to go to Mars someday. Whatever you believe about the veracity of the ability to go to Mars. Welcome, and today we're going to be looking at the Reset War. Now on this channel we looked at the Reset War in 1847 in the past, a conflict that we believe to be global, or at least encompassing all the lands, where the new powers took over. However, looking at the 5 eras theory, I realized the Reset War started earlier with the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, a global conflict, and then continued throughout the duration until the mid-19th century. But what was the height of these Reset War conflicts? And looking back on it, I'm not wondering if this was the Napoleonic conflict, if that was the time when the Reset Wars reached their pinnacle, when a global conflict had the vast powers that be trying to destroy the old world remnants. When you study the history of conflict, one thing you'll notice is that there seems to be quite a push for reenactment. And there's a variety of reenactments that you can watch wherever you are in the lands. If you're in Europe, they certainly enjoy reenacting medieval conflict. In the United States, they enjoy reenacting the Civil War. I suppose if you look hard enough, you can find some Revolutionary War reenactments, but by far and away in the United States, the most popular reenactment is the Civil War. And even some Napoleonic conflict reenactment. And the reason being is that it's exciting to reenact conflict, and it also provides the true historical immersive experience for many people. And this is where people can get the idea that plate armor only weighed 35 to 55 pounds. Well, let's look at Napoleon, Carlo Bonaparte, his father, who was a diplomat and a lawyer and a politician, which I guess is really the same thing. Napoleon didn't come from a military family. He came from a political family, and here's his mother, Maria Bonaparte, and they changed the name, something else interesting from the origin of Corsica, the island that Napoleon and his family came from. There was a movement in the late 18th century that Corsica was going to be free. Napoleon's upbringing was supposedly dominated by his mother, and in that respect he shares a lot with Douglas MacArthur, a famous American military leader. But Napoleon was considered more of a revolutionary thinker, a maverick, and he went to the military academy in Paris, and eventually was commissioned an officer in artillery, or cannons at that time. Now, looking at the conflicts of the 18th century or the 1700s, we always see that armies were considered to be small and professional. At least that's what we're told. And one of the great military revolutions, or revolution in military affairs and military revolutions where they changed everything, was what was called mass mobilization, where they conscripted all the able-bodied men at the time, at least that's what we're told happened, in France and then in other nations. And Napoleon had risen from the ranks as just a very unknown commander who was an artillery officer, and he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. This was during the time of the French Revolution, when the people of France, who supposedly had a history of resisting the absolute monarchy that they had had there for centuries, suddenly decided to bring it off in the late 1700s. Supposedly they were motivated by the ideals of the successful American Revolution. And Napoleon carved out a name for himself by being one of the officers that initially supported what was called the First French Republic, the government that succeeded the monarchy of France after they had taken it over in a very violent revolution. And we're going to be looking a little more closely at that revolution, because if you want an official historical account of what happened in France, well, by all means, look it up. But here we're looking at more of an alternative account. And we start with Maximilien Robespierre. He was one of the leaders of the revolution and one of the early pioneering leaders in the new French Republic, or so we're told. Yet he had some very fanatical ideas, and you'd think that the people of France might have been a little bit more leery of someone like Oliver Cromwell and the rule of the major generals, which had happened in neighboring Great Britain not too long before that. But it's funny how a contemporary historical perspective didn't seem to apply at the time. And they had declared their own declaration, I like that symbol up at the top, about how France was going to be a free area and that it was going to be a republic, much in the vein that the new fledgling United States was, even though the Constitution had only been recently established in the United States. And of course, we have these accounts of how prominent American diplomats and one of the founding fathers, Jefferson, was very intimately involved in Paris, France. Of course, under the rule of Robespierre, it devolved in what was called the Terror, and this is a caricature of how Robespierre decided to have everybody guillotined in France and reducing the entire population. Here he's shown executing the executioner. Yet, at the same time, there's a conflicting account that Robespierre was about abolishing slavery. So I guess he was a murderer and he was about abolishing slavery, so I guess it's a quality you could say he shared with abolitionist John Brown. Although if you look in contemporary American historical accounts of John Brown, he wasn't a murderer, he was simply an abolitionist. So, well, who am I to judge? Long story short, though, it indicates that there was a lot of political instability in France. Now, was this revolution happening the way that we were told it happened, or was this really the imposition of an entirely new society and a new civilization after a reset? That's something that we don't consider when we look back at the start of France's little First Republic, because of the fact that they seem to impose an entirely new religion under this Robespierre guy. He wanted to bring about what they called the cult of the divine supreme being. And I might be translating that improperly, but trying to study it, it's really unique in the fact that it regards the study of God and religion as something that has more of a pragmatic application. It seems as though Robespierre wanted to change every facet of French society and French civilization. And initially, this seemed to be embraced by the people until he clearly went too far. And that's really what you have after this French Revolution. So first the monarchy went too far, then this new government went too far, and then Napoleon took over this new government, had himself declared emperor, and then he went too far. Well, poor old Robespierre was eventually seized by the people in an uprising against him and tried to shoot himself, much in the same way that Edward Norton did back in the movie Fight Club. And he was just as ineffective, although he injured himself a little bit more in the fact that his entire jaw was shattered when he tried to shoot himself. And there's some very convincing and historically well-documented sketches of how he had to have his jaw tied back onto his head prior to his execution. The same execution that he had dispensed to so many unfortunate individuals in France, according to the official history. And Robespierre met his final doom at the hands of the guillotine. While that was all going on, though, there was the attempt by the established European powers, or so we're told, to reassert control in France, and this led to a war of coalitions. And one of the early coalitions attempted to restore the monarchy within France, but they failed. Napoleon earned his reputation by being a commander within this First Republic's army. And he was very effective. He utilized artillery and he was very revolutionary at the same time. As France rose to power, he embarked upon a campaign in Egypt. Now, this is where things get very interesting because this campaign in Egypt, we're told he embarked upon because he wanted to undermine Great Britain's ability to trade, which is quite interesting because the British had the Indian colonies at that time, after they had lost the American colonies, so the official history states. But how would you undermine trade with the Far East if there was no Suez Canal at the time? Well, they tried to explain this by saying that Napoleon wanted to seize Egypt and he wanted to work really close with the Ottoman Empire, and that was the way that they were going to undermine British influence at the time. You have a lot of wondrous romantic paintings and notions of Napoleon being in Egypt, such as here with the Sphinx, and it looks very different than what we see the Sphinx looks like today. We'll be told that because of the centuries of neglect and great death storms and sand in the Sahara, that it covered the Sphinx and it covered the Great Pyramids. Although the differing depictions that we have from the Napoleonic conflict paint a very questionable picture of what was really going on. Was it really as we were told, or was there something else entirely that was transpiring with the Napoleonic Wars that were about to start? At this time, it was simply ending what was called the War of the Second Coalition, or Great Britain and its royal powers. And Napoleon led his army rather successfully in Egypt, and we did cover this in another exploration and how this introduced the whole idea of the pre-existing civilization in Egypt to the good people of France and ultimately all of Europe. And yes, the venerated Carl Sagan covers it in Cosmos, in the fact that this is how people figured out how to translate hieroglyphics. But back to topic. We know that Napoleon was an effective military commander, and we're told by the official history that he's one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. And while the campaign seemed successful, we're also given another account that the First Republic did not support its army very well in Egypt. And here's a picture of the Suez Canal, and this is what we'd expect to see if they were launching a campaign into Egypt. It should also be noted that in World War II, the Wehrmacht, the German defense forces, were led by Rommel's campaign in Africa, and his ultimate objective was to seize the Suez Canal, to deprive trade, and also at that time the oil that was being brought in from the Middle East to Great Britain and to support the Allied war effort. But there was no canal established at the time when Napoleon went into Egypt. So was everything being banked on this alliance with the Ottomans, and they were going to undermine the British that way in what was called an indirect approach? When you look at operational strategy and the operational approach, an indirect approach is not attacking the enemy's strength directly by fighting their army in the field, but trying to deprive it by targeting its critical vulnerabilities. But what exactly were the critical vulnerabilities? This is why I get the theory that the reality is Napoleon was actually one of the approved commanders of the forces behind the reset. What they were really doing is that they were destroying the remnants of the pre-existing civilization in Egypt. And you almost get the feeling that what was really going on here was that they were working in tandem with the other powers that be to achieve that in the Middle East by destroying the enclaves that still existed there. It makes a lot more sense than this First Republic and Napoleon going off on this indirect approach campaign. You even still have the skeleton of his horse depicted in the museum in Great Britain or the United Kingdom to this day. I'll tell you what, no one better ever be displaying the skeleton of my horse long after I'm gone. And we also have the classic culturally accepted image of Napoleon, the very maverick and motivated commander, but he always looked like he was a little sad or a little depressed in all his depictions. And the explanation for that'll be, well, it was after he was defeated and he knew that his great push for power as a political maverick in Europe was finished. Yet at the same time, there's an interesting comparison between the official history and what we interpret as the alternate history. There was also the Battle of the Nile, a naval battle in 1798, where the wondrous Royal Navy managed to defeat the French Navy, and this deprived the logistical support that Napoleon's army would need in Egypt. And this was at the behest of Napoleon's long adversary, or antagonist, Horatio Nelson. So Napoleon did what any good commander would do, and he left his army to be destroyed in Egypt because there was political machinations going on in the First Republic in France. They changed forms of government numerous times after the revolution, so the official history says. And like a good commander, you leave your army behind because a military genius knows when you have to bail out. And so the official history tells us that the French army surrendered to the British after the Battle of Alexandria, and they were paroled to be allowed to go back to France. A very interesting account. It's also interesting that no one in the French military seemed to have any issue with the fact that Napoleon just left his command, and he had a conspiracy to confront. And unlike Captain Picard in that eponymous episode in Star Trek Next Generation, Napoleon seemed more prepared to confront that conspiracy. Captain Picard confronted the conspiracy by being unarmed and nonchalantly enjoying a glass of pee when he did so. Well, Napoleon went back and he eventually had himself appointed as leader of the First Republic, or First Consul, or whatever title that they had. And we have this great picture of him, and here he doesn't look so depressed, and he's got his hand in his pocket. Well, we're told that the hand in the pocket shows calm and stable leadership. And no doubt, someone who had just abandoned their army to be destroyed in Egypt because they had to go back and take control of the government, that's calm and stable leadership. Imagine if MacArthur, after he left the Philippines, and granted MacArthur was following orders, or so we're told when he left the Philippines, he took a detour to Washington, D.C. and decided that he was going to impose what he believed was a more effective democratic government and representing the will of the people. Well, they established this Constitution of the year 8 at that time when Napoleon returned. I find it interesting that this shows yet another chronology and dating system, and this year 8 was year 8 of the First French Republic. Very unique that we have this account of a constitution and a year that is different from the chronology that we have. So once again, this shows us, could this really be designating a year after the reset? Year 8 after the new forces, the new authority came to restore order after the reset? It's yet another conflicting account, and we're not sure, but I find it quite fascinating that they do have another dating system. Well, at this time, Napoleon still seemed to be operating within the authority of the forces behind the reset because there was little resistance. He managed to win several battles and end this so-called War of the Coalition that was led by Great Britain against the powers of France. Napoleon was always successful militarily, except when he bailed on his army. And this led to the treaty that was signed between Great Britain and France, which recognized the end of this conflict. It was also really the end of Great Britain's attempts to end the First French Republic. Now, what's fascinating about this is looking into this, there was all this effort being generated across a conflict that encompassed all the lands. And suddenly, because things seemed to have settled down, everybody was willing to settle for the fact that it was over. And I'm not wondering if what was really going on here is this was the appointed time when they were supposed to stop fighting, that they had achieved their objectives in destroying many of the enclaves where they had targeted, and therefore the conflict had ended. We have to look at different interpretations. During this little period of stability was when France supposedly engaged in the Louisiana Purchase, when they had sold their lands in what would become the western United States to the United States. And that generated the Lewis and Clark expedition. And there's certainly nothing historically questionable about the Lewis and Clark expedition. It's very well documented. You even have this incredible monument that just happens to be an obelisk in Council Bluffs to one of the random soldiers on this expedition that died to this day. We'll be exploring that in due time, and it's always interesting to me how there's these wondrous monuments that just happen to be randomly placed in the lands. But this reflects the changing nature of the political structure at that time, and geopolitics were changing. Well, Napoleon goes renegade when he has himself declared emperor. And what do I think's the basis behind that? It seems as though all of his actions as leader of the First French Republic were sanctioned by the forces of the reset. But it seems as though, and what Elizabeth Clara Prophet used to say when she believed that there was a connection between Napoleon and Saint Germain and Napoleon represented the forces of democracy, it's pretty funny, an old episode of In Search of, Napoleon had gone power mad. Now, did he really go power mad, or did he simply see an opportunity in terms of wanting to have himself declared a higher leader within the forces of the reset? I suspect that he wanted to carve out his own position. Therefore, he had himself declared emperor. And the fact that he had himself declared emperor was completely unacceptable to the forces of the reset. So Napoleon was no longer a legitimate, accepted master and commander of the forces behind the reset. Now he had gone renegade. Because if you look at this transitional period, this time frame, which official history tells us was 1804 to 1805, and who knows if this was the actual chronology or the years, because as we said, we just saw with this year 8 of the Constitution, it's hard to say what the actual unfolding of this time was. And this series of conflicts that we call the Reset War, we don't know how many years it actually took. Well, regardless, the fact that Napoleon was now a Reset War renegade, Great Britain led another coalition to remove him from power in France, and they quickly reneged on the treaty that they had signed earlier. Well, Napoleon just didn't sit around in France, and he decided to go on the offensive, fighting in the Battle of Ulm against the Austrian forces, which was one of the first major battles in the Napoleonic Wars, as they called it. Napoleonic Wars lasted overall from 1804 to 1815, again, according to the official chronology. And these battles took place all over Europe, including Central Europe, Spain, and ultimately culminating in a campaign in Russia. But let's go through that and consider our interpretations. What was different about Napoleonic warfare, though, was that these were very large armies. And in fact, one of the questionable aspects about the Napoleonic conflict is the logistical capacity to field such large armies at that time. Now, the hand-wave answer that you'll get from the historians is that Napoleon's army were masters of foraging for all the supplies and logistics that they needed. The question of logistics is something we have to ask, because you can't just keep a large army of 60, 70, 80,000 in the field without providing for logistics. I find the account that they simply foraged for what they needed to be very problematic at best. And yet we're told that Napoleon was able to effectively do it. Well, during that same year, 1805, he had some problems in the Battle of Trafalgar. His long nemesis, Admiral Horatio Nelson, the great indomitable naval hero of Great Britain, managed to defeat the allied French and Spanish Navy in the Battle of Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar is interesting because it involves one of the significant naval clashes between what they called ships of the line at that time. Nelson was indeed such a great naval hero that he's the one they built the monument in Scotland towards. The one that's a telescope that appears to be shoved in the ground and looks like a tower, but they tell us it's a telescope, so it must be a telescope. Enough on that. Back to the actual naval conflict. Nelson always employed very aggressive tactics in his naval approaches, so the official history tells us. This tactic is called crossing the T. Typically, it doesn't work so well when you're crossing the T because all the enemy ships, which are in blue, can broadside you. But Nelson attacked aggressively, and having the wind, he managed to break the line, and this is how he won the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, managing to capture many French and Spanish ships, and then unfortunately having to destroy many of them. And Nelson himself died in the battle, which is why he's always fondly remembered and is no doubt one of the greatest military heroes in British history. However, looking at this overall conflict, it prevented the French from ever challenging Great Britain in naval conflict again. Yet for some reason we're told the British needed to engage in what was called impressment, in other words, seizing trained sailors from the United States, and that was one of the main causes of the War of 1812. And we talked about how poorly the United States performed in the War of 1812. Back to the Napoleonic Wars, and Napoleon followed up the battle against the Austrians by winning the Battle of Austerlitz, or the Battle of the Three Emperors. The three emperors being Napoleon, Tsar Alexander, and the Habsburg Emperor at the time. This was a battle which Napoleon won by setting a trap and attacking the center of the line of the Allies and dividing them in two. It's quite interesting that on paper it would seem that a lot of the Napoleonic tactics just seem very brash, and yet he always had two favorite forms of maneuver. He would envelop the enemy army, or he would attack what was called their apex point, or their weak point in the middle, divide it in two, and then destroy one side at a time. It seems to be a very simple tactic and a very direct operational approach, and yet all anybody can tell us, especially from historical circles, is what a great military genius Napoleon was. And perhaps he was. Or perhaps there was more going on, that he had resources and he had the ability to employ things that had caught the powers of the reset off guard. This pyramid was built by French soldiers as some sort of monument to Austerlitz. Quite an impressive pyramid, and this is something I would love to explore in person to see what the real nature of this is. And I was completely unaware of this and was surprised to see that there was indeed a structure associated with the Battle of Austerlitz. Now, the so-called Battle of the Three Emperors was a great victory for France and the Napoleonic regime at the time. I also find it interesting in terms of how Napoleon's regarded, because Directly, he seems like he's a tyrant and caused the direct deaths of 6 million people in Europe, and yet at the same time, he also seems to be regarded with that passive, how shall we say, historical reevaluation. Well, after defeating the other two emperors, Napoleon moved on and defeated Prussia, or what would later become East Germany. Prussian military having supposedly a very wonderful reputation from Frederick the Great in the mid-18th century. Napoleon easily defeated the Prussian armies, of course, and marched in Berlin, capturing it. And really, after defeating the Russians in the subsequent Battle of Friedland, and this forced the Russian Tsar to negotiate with Napoleon. And oddly enough, we have another structure, this bridge built in Paris for defeating the Prussians. So it seems as though we have all these great military achievements during the Napoleonic Wars, and they always involve a very large and elaborate structure that's built with them. What an impressive bridge, too. And we've looked at many bridges in other cities and locations across the land, and yet here we have a pyramid, and now we have an impressive bridge that are associated with the great achievements of Napoleon during the Napoleonic conflict. It paints quite an interesting conflicting picture with what's really going on once again, but, you can do all kinds of engineering achievements. Well, after defeating the Russians, Tsar Alexander had to come to the peace table in the Treaty of Tislet, or the Treaties of Tislet, and they met on a raft in the middle of the river. And this is such an interesting depiction. And the Napoleonic conflict is noted by being represented by all these very dramatic paintings here. And I have to say, looking at the meeting between Napoleon and Alexander, you have to wonder what was the real nature behind it. Was this really Alexander simply bargaining for time, as Tsar Alexander no doubt represented the forces of the reset? Or did something else entirely happen? Was Napoleon such a great maverick, or was he merely a renegade? This is a very interesting depiction of Napoleon's little meeting with Alexander, and they seem very chummy. Well, after that, Napoleon moved into the peninsula and began the occupation of Spain, no doubt wanting to secure his flank, although this was a dreadful mistake because once he had conquered Spain, he put his brother Joseph in charge. And this was a dreadful mistake because this gave the British the opportunity to deploy Arthur Wellesley, later known as the first Duke of Wellington, to begin the Peninsula Campaign, and this became an indirect approach that the British effectively used to undermine Napoleon's campaign. He also had the presence of Richard Sharp, an officer raised from the ranks of the 95th Rifles, and Wellesley's secret weapon was Richard Sharp. Whenever he needed something done, he always deployed Richard Sharp. And Richard Sharp was such an unbelievable badass that he could be portrayed by actor Sean Bean and not die, which is an achievement in and of itself. After the Peninsula Campaign, things soured between France and Russia, and Napoleon engaged in an invasion of Russia, which is well studied to this day. Indeed, this line shows his army of 600,000 as it marched into Russia and was slowly attrited over battles and losses over time. There's a conflicting account between how this all started, though, that Napoleon had to put a lot of effort into this, that he had to prepare supply bases, and yet if you look at older historical sources, they'll tell you, no, they just foraged off the land. Either way, it's rather ridiculous that an army of over 500,000 managed to sustain itself, extended and crossed many rivers to go to Moscow. But what was the real reason that Napoleon went into Russia? We're told that it was Russia wasn't playing nice and wasn't respecting Napoleon's continental system, and they were trading with Great Britain, and this was undermining Napoleon's plan to isolate his last major enemy, Great Britain. But if this was an indirect approach, why do you marshal the largest army and go into a very distant land where your lines of logistics and communications are challenged? There had to be some other goal or some other reason for Napoleon to go into Russia, and indeed he did not target the capital, St. Petersburg, at the time. He went after Moscow. And he certainly would have known that St. Petersburg was the actual capital, but when you look at accounts, we're told that Moscow is the capital. Well, despite winning the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon had to withdraw from Moscow because the Tsar wouldn't negotiate with him, and this was a disastrous retreat for the French army. Yet you'll also see conflicting accounts that the Grand Army suffered from logistical issues in the summer. And if you look on that line chart earlier, you can see that the Grand Army was attrited earlier in the summer. But there's so many things about this. Impossible logistical feats, moving an army such a large distance. Even in modern times, in World War II, the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain its lines of logistics with motorized and mechanized transportation in World War II. And we're to believe that Napoleon did it? Nearly 200 years ago? Well, of course we are. It's a well-documented historical account. What was the real objective? And if this did happen, what was really going on? Because while we have all these dramatic images of this French retreat from Russia after the failed invasion, what was it really about? Was there another reason that the French invaded to capture Moscow? And it seems as though Moscow was the main goal. Well, what's Moscow really the gateway towards? It's the gateway towards Siberia, or what was likely the pre-existing civilization. Well, according to the official history, Napoleon bailed on his army yet again because there was an uprising in France that he had to put down, and pretty much the entire French army was destroyed. And then Napoleon had no choice but to abdicate because after losing an army of 500,000, you really don't have many options when the coalition is approaching. And there was a great battle of the nations, and we'll be looking at the monument that was built to that in Germany in Leipzig in due time. Well, Napoleon was exiled to Elba, but that wasn't good enough because he was basically given his own little area to rule in Elba. He got on a ship, went back to France, and was once again accepted by the army that he had bailed on twice and the people he had left behind, and reinstalled as emperor. He was defeated again by the Duke of Wellington in the Battle of Waterloo, and then sent to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, basically the middle of nowhere. He was given a nice mansion to live in, though. Oddly enough, there's a lot of people that say that the British were trying to kill him by allowing him to live in a mansion. I guess he was just used to palatial living, and during that retreat from Moscow, he managed to live in palaces, even though we have cool paintings of him being drawn on a sleigh through blizzards. But this just wasn't healthy for a person who was a world ruler. It doesn't make any sense, though, if this guy was considered the enemy of humanity and they still give him a mansion when they exile him. And indeed, to this day, Napoleon has a tomb for a leader responsible for 6 million deaths. So does this make any sense with the official history? Or does it make more sense that Napoleon was a recognized commander of the reset forces who had gone renegade, but then was ultimately forgiven and still given his proper honors after he had passed away? Indeed, this has me looking at reevaluating the entire Reset War theory for the channel, because originally I had thought that the Reset War started in the 1850s. Although granted, as I said, we have no idea what the actual year was, and we have no way to know that the chronology that we're given is correct. We can see that there are many different chronologies with many different baseline events that start different timelines. But if the Reset War really did start with the 7 Years' War in what we think of as the mid-18th century or the 1750s or the 1760s, it has an entirely new dimension. And there seem to be indications that this conflict did take place for many decades, perhaps even as long as 100 years. Or maybe it was merely compressed in 20 years, and it's another example of messing around with the chronology and the timeline, so we have no idea of what's really going on. Well, if you're into Napoleon, there's a new film coming out directed by great director Ridley Scott, and Joaquin Phoenix himself portrays Napoleon. And we know that he's a great actor, and I've got to say, he's got the very depressed, detached look of Napoleon down pat. And it should be noted that Vanessa Kirby plays Empress Josephina, and she seems to have quite a charismatic presence. So much so that Joaquin Phoenix has to indulge in all of his acting capabilities to seem disinterested in her advances. He looks like I do when someone wants to offer me to take me out to fast food. We've got explosions, we got flying soldiers, we got somersaulting horses, a great contemporary soundtrack. I think this is going to be a great film from Ridley Scott. Look, I'm just trying to get excited about this film, and Ridley Scott's a great director. He's due for a good movie. He's had a couple misfires the last couple times. Hey, remember when Joaquin Phoenix portrayed Max in Space Camp? You remember the kid who got sent into space? Send Max to space. Max won't live that long. I certainly remember it. Look, I'm come to the point now where there's really nothing in Hollywood or that comes out of Hollywood that'll upset me. Well, I guess we all have burdens to bear, and I certainly have mine. Well, I hope you enjoyed this alternative exploration of Napoleon. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Welcome back to the Restitute or Orbis channel. Now I'm going to be honest with everybody. I was looking to take a day off from doing a video, but after receiving some very warm, heartfelt comments on yesterday's video, I thought that when someone suggested that I was releasing too much content, that I owed it all to you, my loyal viewers, to do a bonus video for Thursday. So here's the bonus video, and we're going to be exploring ghost cities or planned cities, and what meaning could they potentially have for this research that we're doing. So what exactly are ghost cities? Well, let's take a look at US China today and see what they can tell us about it. Cities lost in limbo. Are China's ghost cities here to stay? China's record number of vacant houses and urban projects, sitting at over 50 million units and growing, are an increasingly worrying domestic challenge. Known as ghost cities, these developments have created a housing bubble representative of decades of Chinese progress, but also turmoil. What else would it be? You can't have progress without turmoil, and vice versa, right? The phrase ghost city might imply a city once full of life and now abandoned, but China's ghost cities are brand new, and their high rises never populated. Many had remained that way for years, byproducts of rapid economic growth that continue to plague the nation's urban planning strategy. Oh, nation's urban planning strategy. Interesting. Today, this abnormal trend should be re examined in the context of a nation turned upside down by a global pandemic. The saw population migrations and a change in the way people live and work in cities. As the world continues to create its post pandemic normalcy, urban planning and land development are key considerations. China's ghost cities did not experience significant pandemic driven influxes in demand, but they are beyond saving. In fact, concepts like social distancing, work from home, and new green initiatives may very well help to drive the next generation of China's urban transformation framework. Whether this spells success for the existing ghost cities is unknown, but at the very least, we can definitely expect to see unprecedented shifts in China's ever growing urban landscape. It sounds so dire. Well, here's what we're really looking for. What is a ghost city? Ghost cities come in many shapes and sizes. While information about them is scarce, of course it is, studies have identified some 50 municipalities of varying sizes, often labeled as development areas, new areas, or eco cities. There's that term. I guess that doesn't mean engine cutoff. They are often located on the outskirts of second and third tier Chinese cities. Most are fully completed, but some were suspended mid construction. Miniature replicas of London, Paris, and European villages have low residency rates, making them perfect venues for wedding photo shoots or film sets. Why on earth would they make miniature replicas of London, Paris, and European villages? I mean, I know Solvang's a pretty little town in California and it attracts a lot of people for its references to classic European villages. But why on earth would you see this in China? Very interesting. The term ghost city was first used by photographers and journalists documenting the Kangbashi district. Located in Ordos, Inner Mongolia, Kangbashi is one of the largest and most well-known ghost cities, originally designed to accommodate over 1 million residents. The urban mega project only housed around 20,000 people. Came up a little short of that 1 million, huh? When it gained international attention around 2009, when journalists flocked to Kangbashi to document its impressive but empty landmarks and buildings. In the years since, the world has directed more attention to these intriguing urban mega projects, but data from local Chinese governments remains scarce. Why on earth would that be? What we know is that apartments erected in ghost cities are rapidly purchased by homeowners who have no intention of moving in, and prices steadily increase. The result is a massive and worrying property bubble. Really? In the face of China's never ending urbanization spree, why are there still so many underpopulated cities? Will China's new initiatives focus on pandemic recovery and environmental sustainability finally challenge the standards of urban planning and shine a light of hope on the future of these cities? What does the future of urban planning look like for China? It's a very good question. According to Max Woodworth, an expert on Chinese urban development, understanding ghost cities requires knowledge of two main factors: the reason houses were built and the reason people buy them. Sounds like Real Estate 101. Let's see what he has to say. Most new urban projects are commissioned by local governments. Officials typically spend anywhere from 2 to 5 years in a regional position before being transferred to Beijing. To improve their track record, local officials often fight to demonstrate concrete economic growth and local development during their term. And here's where we have the money shot right here. Deciding to build a new town is just one simple way to demonstrate results, Woodworth says. Officials have a strong incentive to construct new cities, as they indicate economic progress in a clear and measurable way. In the late 20th century, many local governments had abundant land that they could lease out to developers to boost economic activity, which kick-started the city building trend. Well, let me get this straight. They're saying that if you want to show that you're successful and you want to work your way up the very well known, or at least reputedly, bureaucratic Chinese government, then you're just going to build a city to show economic progress, regardless of whether it's needed or not. This is very intriguing. And we're to believe that local officials on their own initiative do this? So we go back to the photos that we have of Paris, France, an empty city that we had looked at before in a previous video on this channel. And of course, we know there could be many reasons for why we have empty streets from the 19th century in Paris, France. Could have simply been early morning hours and nobody was out and about, or maybe they were told that there was some sort of strange green gas that was floating around that was going to turn their bodies inside out if it touched them. Remember that episode of The Simpsons? It was one of the Treehouse of Horror episodes. In any event, we do have these pictures, and they're a little bit strange because do they show an empty or abandoned city, or do they simply show a city that has no signs of life and no activity, of which there could be numerous explanations for? Not sure, but why would anybody go to all the trouble of going to Paris, France, and not take pictures of the population? Well, maybe they just wanted to get some pictures of the great buildings. Why would they want that? Well, we'll stop asking questions. And here we go to one of our cities in China. And this is the one that obviously has the Eiffel Tower. How fitting, just like Paris. I wonder if anybody in France would feel offended by this, that China's simply ripping them off. Well, I guess they've got the Eiffel Tower that's in Las Vegas, and nobody feels offended by that, do they? I mean, it's just Las Vegas. Pretty decent replica, I've got to say. Although none of the rest of the city remotely resembles Paris, it's intriguing that they put the Eiffel Tower at the center here. And they're looking for some sort of draw to it. I don't know, do a lot of people in China have dreams of wanting to live in a city that resembles Paris, or do they just think it's really cool to have an Eiffel Tower there? I mean, we can see that this thing is pretty large. It's just strange. What do you think in the comments? What's the reason for this? Does anybody live in China? Is anyone affiliated with someone who's involved with this development project, or one of these so-called local officials that we're told about in the article who just decides to take this kind of initiative? And apparently they can. So I don't know. Could the article be wrong? Everywhere we look, we see these lines of buildings that just go on and on and on. All this residential housing. The article makes it clear that these cities do exist, and yet they are not remotely close to being populated. 20,000 for a city of 1 million? 50 municipalities? And it's nothing to sneeze at. And of course, we're told that the population of China being well over 1 billion for many years now. Does this have some other purpose, though? And that's the question we have to ask. These planned cities that they just build, as though they've really gone with the whole mantra, if you build it, they will come. Yeah, I know, it was he will come. Look at this, just all these high-rises, all this office space, all these residential areas, all this commercial space. And the article did acknowledge the fact that government is spending a lot of money just to keep these places operational. What is really going on here, though? Why would they do this? And why would they commit these expenditures if they don't have a reason to? When we look at the development of many cities in our history, and we always know there was a reason to build a building. Or at least the reasons that we're told. Many of the naysayers will tell us that in the 19th century you had these robber barons, and they wanted to build these elaborate buildings, and this was how they showed off their wealth, their status, and their power. Okay. And yet we have an article that's telling us this is done for the same reason. That these cities are built just so a local official can show off their economic development prowess. It's eerie how there seems to be a lot of similarities and parallels in these accounts. What is truly going on? Is there some more sinister purpose behind these planned cities, or these ghost cities as they're called? I don't think I've ever heard any accounts of any of these unused cities ever being torn down. So all these buildings and all of this structure and infrastructure is still there, unoccupied, just sitting there. And the more of these images you see, the more eerie that this becomes. I'm reminded of the early 1970s science fiction movie with Charlton Heston called The Omega Man, when he's driving around Los Angeles, and apparently they had to film that on the weekend. And of course, we're just looking at images, but we have multiple accounts of these ghost cities in China. And it's interesting because this phenomena is not just confined to China. We go back to our five eras theory, and we have to wonder, is it possible that someone could be setting conditions for another sort of reset? Are they looking to continue to change what we have on recorded history? Is this one of the first indicators with these ghost cities or these planned cities that they could be doing something to serve this end of continuing to confuse what our awareness is of our true history and our own identity? Or so let's go to our friends at Encyclopedia Britannica to give us an account of one of the so-called planned cities in Turkmenistan, the national capital no less, Ashgabat. Ashgabat, formerly Ashgabad, and many other names. From period of 1919 to 1927, it was known as Poltoratsk. Poltoratsk, city and capital of Turkmenistan. It lies in an oasis at the northern foot of the Kopet Dag, Turkmen Kopet Dag range, and on the edge of the Karakum Garagum Desert, about 19 miles, 30 kilometers from the Iranian frontier. So the capital's not that far from the border. Intriguing. It was founded in 1881 as a Russian military fort and took the name of the nearby Turkmen settlement of Ashgabat. It became the administrative center of the Trans-Caspian Oblast province, and because of its position on the caravan routes and on the Trans-Caspian Railway, attracted a population that numbered more than 45,000 by 1911. If you found it, they will come. After the Russian Revolution, the city soon was renamed Poltoretsk after a local revolutionary. And anyone, feel free to correct my pronunciation. From 1924 to 1990, it was the capital of Turkmenistan, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1927, it reverted to its original name, Ashgabat. One of the most violent earthquakes ever registered in the region virtually destroyed the city in October 1948. It was rebuilt on the same regular plan. So again, we have this interesting city with this account that we're all too familiar with. What are the odds? A chronic water shortage was alleviated considerably when the Karakum Canal reached the city in 1962. In 1992, the government of newly independent Turkmenistan officially adopted the Turkmen version of the city's name, Ashgabat. Ashgabat is now an administrative, industrial, transportation, and cultural center. The city has glassworks, carpet weaving, and cotton mills, and metalworking shops. Its spectacular natural setting also made it a center for the filmmaking industry. There are several institutions of higher education, including Turkmen A.M. Gorky State University, 1950, and Polytechnic, Agricultural, and Medical Institutes. The Turkmen Academy of Sciences, founded in 1951, they just can't resist, includes the unique Institute of Deserts. Wouldn't mind studying there. I wonder what that would be like. Other amenities include an opera house and theaters, as well as several museums. Population as of 2007 estimated to be 750,000, give or take. Very intriguing. Let's take a look at Ashgabat. Looking at Ashgabat, we see the beautiful presidential palace. I believe that's what this structure is. Although, in the interest of full disclosure with you viewers, there is a lot of conflicting accounts about Ashgabat, and that's the reason why I stuck with just the Encyclopedia Britannica. Any sort of media entry or traveler's entry, and they classify the city as strange, they classify it as a closed, oppressive regime, and those may be true facts, or it could be something else entirely different. So we're just going to look at the city based on the small account that we got from Encyclopedia Britannica and take it at face value. And what we see are some very beautiful and well-developed buildings. We're told that this is all white marble, and I don't see any reason to doubt that, although I have not been there, and if anyone has actually been there, please let us know in the comments. But based on the accounts that you do read from some reporters and travelers, all of this is white marble as far as the eye can see. It's very beautiful and it's very impressive. And it shows that a modern city can be constructed with artistic inspiration. It is certain to say that a lot of what we're looking at surpasses in beauty the so-called brutalist or even the contemporary quote-unquote postmodern architecture or interior design that we're subjected to, especially in our modern hotels across the United States. I haven't stayed at modern hotels in other nations, so I can't speak for them, but I can say that my hotel experiences in the United States have been lacking. It's one of the main reasons why I prefer bed and breakfast. But just look at this beauty. The visual beauty is very striking. This looks like a city that, even if you are in a desert, you're not going to feel like you're in a desert. They've done a very good job of giving it that oasis feel, and yet there's so much beauty and brightness everywhere you look, along with some very creative artistic designs. Look at some of these buildings and the layout of these parks. Geometric designs. It's almost as though it's advanced in a way that we can't even begin to imagine. Looks like you got a little pyramid over there or a built-up building. And just some of the other building designs. We're not seeing our usual square block designs. I mean, we are in places. Yet it looks like they put a little bit more effort into making this more of a beautiful city aesthetically. Why is that? And why do we not see that in our modern cities across the so-called Western world? It's very strange. And again, this simply increases the number of questions that we would have about this sort of city. Now, this is not labeled or listed as a ghost city like we just looked at in China, but this is in the same continent, albeit further to the west in Turkmenistan, a former Soviet Socialist Republic until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Look at this. And I can look up the name and the function of this, but what is its real intention and purpose? Is this just a decorative building? Or does this have some other purpose? And I've looked at it in some of the media entries, and I'm not sure if I'm even going to buy what they're trying to sell by saying that this is just merely a ceremonial building where people will get married at. Does this have some other purpose? Could it have some other purpose potentially in the future? What do you all think? Let me know in the comments. It's beautiful. I especially like the golden sphere in the middle. I mean, is this just as it appears? This is just some unique building that was just built out there to gain and garner attention. It does have artistic beauty to it. And there is some variance in the structure. And then look at these structures. Now, we could argue that the one on the right has, some of those lovely right angles to it. But still, it looks as though at least they're trying to bring out some unique buildings. What's really the explanation behind this? And what are they really attempting to achieve here? The other interesting thing is a city like this in Central Asia with this kind of beauty. And I can recall the last time that I was in the Middle East, and it wasn't that long ago. It was the late 2000s, early 2010s I was in the Middle East. And I certainly don't recall seeing this kind of beauty. There was definitely some ancient structures that were around and a lot of ruins, but not a modern, beautiful city like this. What is really going on with Ashgabat? And how does it fit in with So now we go to take a look at Astana, Expo City 2017, Astana, Kazakhstan, from our friends at World Construction Network. Expo City? Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture will design Astana Expo City 2017 in preparation for an international expo being held in Astana, Kazakhstan in 2017. Nothing suspicious here. What other gold nuggets do we have in this article? Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture will design the Expo City, yes, in preparation for an international expo being held in Astana, Kazakhstan in 2017. The architects were selected after an international design competition. Does this sound familiar? Astana Expo City will be located south of Bayturk Tower and east of Nazarbayev University. The expo will run for 3 months, starting from 10 June 2017. I wonder if they had 40, 50 million people attend. Future energy will be the theme for the expo, which will focus on discovering innovative developments for the energy sector, as well as promoting alternative energy sources and cleaner modes of transportation. The Expo City will be developed in 2 phases, with Phase 1 scheduled for completion in December 2016. What, they're not just going to throw it up in a couple months? Immense detail. Well, what do we got for design details? The most significant feature of the Expo City will be Kazakhstan's sphere-shaped pavilion, which will be spread across 24,000 meters squared in the middle of the city. Featuring a convertible outer layer, the pavilion is designed to control the entry of light and simultaneously reduce heat loss. The buildings will highlight the salient features of its site and culture and include sustainable characteristics. Different buildings have been designed to reduce energy use, harvest additional energy, and improve comfort levels. The energy output of each building will be managed by means of multiple integrated systems. High performance glazing will be featured in the buildings to capture more solar heat during the winter and provide shade during the summer. The temperature within the buildings will be controlled by modulations, while energy piles will decrease the site's energy demand. Interesting. What else have they got to tell us? Phases of the Astana Expo City. The first phase of the project, named the Expo Mode, will cover the design and construction related to the Expo. The buildings constructed during this phase will include central Kazakhstan corporate and international pavilions, as well as hotels and retail and performance areas. So again, this reads just like a classic World's Fair. To attract international companies and entrepreneurs, expo-related infrastructure will be converted into an additional 700 residential units, as well as office, hotels, local markets, civic and educational facilities. Master plan details. The master plan for the Expo City is based on weather conditions, cultural context, and land accessibility related to the project's location. The covered city concept will connect important landmarks, including Nazarbayev University, the train station, and the Expo buildings. It has been designed to be pedestrian friendly and accessible throughout the year. It sounds just like Chicago World's Fair, doesn't it? A public park will also be part of the Expo City, which will be connected to a larger park system. The master plan includes the construction of a smart energy grid. Oh, there's that word again, smart. An integrated waste management system and interseasonal underground and thermal energy storage areas. It has been designed to reduce total energy demand, water use, and waste targets. They really emphasize that. All right, let's take a look at Astana and see what this expo provided this city. So it's the same old story again. We have an expo, we have a World's Fair, we have architectural competitions, and here we see the beautiful city of Astana in Kazakhstan. Just unbelievable beauty everywhere you look, and you actually see they're attempting different architectural cues. We see some domes, we see some pyramid structures, some unique buildings that are covered in what appears to be gold, although who knows what it is really. Just this view alone is artistically impressive. What exactly are we looking in between? I'm sure there's some naysayers out there that'll say that the entire building is, or the entire set of constructions, such as this building, are made out of paper mache and that good old stucco. But look at that dome and the tower on that. It's still a beautiful building. Yes, it's a modern building, but you get the feeling that they put some effort into it. I mean, look at the beautiful park that's out in front of it. What exactly is going on with these cities. I mean, we know they're not planned cities, but yet they seem like they're planned cities. And yet, in another respect, they very much are planned cities with what we see with the architecture, and there's something very different about them. Now, is there a reason for us to be concerned about this? This is supposedly a shopping center. Imagine going to a shopping center that looked like that. Now, I don't know if any of these accounts or what I'm reading is correct. So if anyone has been there or if they have better knowledge, please share. Because I've not been to Kazakhstan, Astana, and I don't know if the accounts being related on these buildings are true. But the fact that they had a World Expo there, I mean, doesn't that tell you that it's a beautiful member of the international community and therefore everything that happened there was appropriate? It's just beautiful. And again, you see something unique with this kind of design. At least they're trying something different. Credit has to be given. Now, does it have sort of a Vegas appearance to it? I don't think so. There's something beautiful in what they're attempting. See the golden sphere up there in that little tower? I mean, what exactly would you call that kind of structure? How would you classify that? I'd be interested to hear what sort of architectural terminology they'd have for this. Well, this is desert image reflective beautification, or something about being in the mountains, or, granted Astana is not nearly in the desert like Ashgabat is, but still, you have that feeling that you're in some remote location. I mean, look at this. You see these different structures and you see these different aspects that they're attempting. Now, could we say that these may be just simple materials that are just configured in a more artistic way? I mean, look at the pyramid. You could easily film any number of science fiction, fantasy, or if we did alternate world, parallel reality movies, or alternate history, which we're not very big on. But look at this. And I think those were the pillars that initial picture was looking out at. And I wonder what those are made out of. What's the construction materials that these buildings were made out of? I mean, we're told that Ashgabat, the city we just looked at, is all white marble. But what exactly is this? It's beautiful. I like the little blue dome. That's definitely a unique touch. Then we've got that little pyramid back there. And then the little tower behind it. I don't know. It almost reminds me of Romulus from Star Trek The Next Generation. The one occasion that we saw it. Very, very beautiful city, though, in the fact that they're trying something different. However, at the same time, we have to wonder what's going on. And this is one of the hotels, and we see through this amazing entryway a view of what we're told is the shopping center, but who knows what the function of all these buildings are. This does have a hotel sort of appearance, but it's beautiful. It certainly exceeds anything that we see that's being built in the United States today, which I'll just use as a comparison. So why is it that Ashgabat and Astana have the beautiful, amazing buildings? Yes, we see the modern construction cues, and there's no doubt that a lot of them fall into these buildings. But it seems as though they're at least trying something different. But why does it seem like they have the license to try something different? Or why is it the plan revolves around constructing something very different? And then, of course, this is the gorgeous pavilion. And here it is in its realized glory. And perhaps this is just a structure that is simply put together and is constructed of very easy to obtain materials and wasn't that difficult. Not denying that. I mean, this is a modern city, but what I'm really questioning is, why do we have this kind of beauty in this city that we don't have in other cities? And of course, we'll have the usual array of reasons, and I certainly invite you to let me know what you think in the comments. Is there something more insidious, though, behind these planned cities, or these ghost cities in China? And of course, they even have an opera house with beautiful columns and the classic pediment, as though we're going back to Rome. And I wonder what this one's made out of. And I'm sure the naysayers will say it's made out of paper mache and balsa wood, and it'll fall down in the first windstorm, and somehow it'll last for a while. Still, I doubt that they would construct something like this. So what's the story behind this opera house? Well, who knows? Still, looking at all these buildings, is there reason for alarm? Is there some purpose behind these certain cities, these planned cities, these ghost cities? How does it factor into what's coming in the future? And last but not least, just in case anybody, especially from the United States, is feeling a little underwhelmed about our buildings, I just thought I'd showcase the Holiday Inn Express that's been provided $43.1 million in a construction loan in the fine city of Nashville. Nashville also has its own version of the Parthenon, which is quite fascinating. And yet, for $43.1 million, this is what you can build. I wonder what it would cost to stay there. Probably $400 a night in king-size bedroom, and you could hear your next-door neighbors breathing at night because, those walls are well constructed and thick. Let me know what you think in the comments. What is really going on with these ghost cities and these planned cities? What's the story behind this, and what are their purposes?
It is wrong. It is wrong. A lifetime of discipline washed away, and in its place,